we can within our powers to help the industry, and we will continue to do so.
Thank you very much. And we now move to the next item of business, which is a debate on motion number S4M 06244 in the name of Michael McMahon on behalf of the Welfare Reform Committee on the impact of welfare reform on Scotland. I would now call on Michael McMahon to speak to and move the motion. Mr McMahon, up to 13 minutes, and I would say before we start that we are very tight on time today, so speakers could stick to the time, please. Mr McMahon.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I am pleased to be able to open this debate on behalf of the Welfare Reform Committee. The rhetoric surrounding welfare reform and the UK Government's austerity agenda has been discussed at some length. However, in having the opportunity to address this topic today and to speak on behalf of the constituents who are extremely concerned about the impact that welfare reform will have on their families, I feel confident saying that as representatives in this Parliament, we are all in it together. Presiding Officer, the motion today invites the Parliament to note the research that the Welfare Reform Committee commissioned from Sheffield Hallam University, and I place on record the Committee's thanks to Professors Steve Fothergill and Christina Beattie for the work they did in producing the research. The purpose of the research was to analyse the impact of welfare reform on Scotland, both nationally and across each of the 32 local authority areas. The headline figure is that the UK Government's package of welfare reforms will result in a loss of £1.6 billion per year to the Scottish economy. This averages out at about £480 for every working-age adult in Scotland. But beyond the headlines, I would like to say a little bit about what the figures actually mean. The loss per year is averaged out across the working-age population, but we know that the loss will in fact be experienced by a far smaller group of people. And within that smaller group, we also know of particular people who face the biggest losses. Women, one-parent families and disabled people will be faced with losses that are far greater than the majority of members would think fair. The Committee's report details the impact of 9 aspects of welfare reform. I will highlight what the impact could be of just 3 of those aspects: incapacity benefit, the move from disability living allowance to personal independence payment, and the under-occupancy provisions for people in social rented sector, otherwise known as the bedroom tax. Now, allow me to quote from page 10 of the Committee's report. Sickness and disability claimants can also expect to be hit hard. The individuals adversely affected by the incapacity benefit reforms can expect to lose an average of £3,000 and £500 a year, and those losing out as a result of the changeover from disability living allowance to personal independence payments by an average of £3,000 a year. Often these will be the same individuals. Most DLA claimants of working age and out of work on incapacity benefits, and in both cases the groups most exposed to benefit reductions are those with less severe disabilities or health problems. The same individuals may also find that they encounter reduction in housing benefit entitlement. So just one person could be faced with a loss of income of around £7,000 a year, simply as a result of 3 of the 9 benefit changes analysed in the research. That is a £7,000 loss each year for individuals who are among the most vulnerable in our society. And beyond the financial loss, vulnerable people are threatened with the loss of security in their lives, like the security of a safe home, close to the support of a family and friend. Just this morning, the Committee heard from people who fear the loss of those securities. So who is it being affected by these so-called reforms? Is it the apparently feckless claimants who see a life on benefits as something to which they are entitled? Is it the families who have not worked in 3 generations, the families that the Joseph Rowntree Foundation found no evidence of when carrying out research in some of the most deprived areas of the country? Or is it the many people who have told the Committee their stories, expressing their fear, confusion and anger when faced with tattered rag that has replaced the safety net of welfare state? People like Ian McGahey, a veterinary surgeon, who explained that when he had to stop work, "I was a senior partner in my own practice and a part-time university lecturer. Before I stopped work, a client took my business partner aside and virtually accused him of being a callous so-and-so for allowing me to be at my work. A lot of the general public think that the chronically ill are feckless people who give up, sit about and do not try. I have made massive efforts to get better. I have a list of 38 treatments, medicines, procedures and so on that I have tried. I desperately want to get back to work. I love my work. Or like Henry Sherlock, who said, I fear without a doubt I will only lose more income once I have to go through the undignified process once again. I am tired of fighting officials who seem to think they know more about my disabilities and needs than I do. It now makes me feel ashamed of who I am. I am being punished for being disabled and feel powerless. Being blind is an isolating disability. If my benefits are slashed in any way, I will become even more isolated. I would not be able to afford to use my computer. This is the only true way of providing me with information and communication. I would not be able to afford the internet, which would cut me off from family and friends. I would not be able to afford the additional high cost of assistive technology I use, which will leave me in danger. I will not be able to afford the support I need. Or like Leslie McMurtry, who told us, my husband paid in for years with the view that when he was older, he would be looked after. He's not being looked after. In fact, the state has contributed to putting him in a worse position than he was in June last year. I am a history graduate, and I thought when we set up the welfare state, it was to be there for people such as my husband, who worked hard and did his best, so that in times of need, something would be there for him. But it's not there. There should be something there for those hard-working men and women who have contributed to society, but they are being left with nothing.
I thank the member for giving way. Talking about something needing to be there, does the member think that enough is there to help the 45% of people on benefit who have a mental health problem? Are we doing enough for them?
Mr McMahon.
No, that's a very easy question to answer. No, we're not. And I'll come on later to some of the evidence that we heard this morning. And rather than not doing enough for them, we're actually appearing to do less and putting them in an even more difficult situation. So I don't really think that that question helps your position at all, Mary.
Mr McMahon, I would just draw to your attention and remind you of the fact that this is the views of the committee. This is not meant to be a political statement, please.
Well, Presiding Officer, when you get asked a political question, there's only one way you can answer it. So I'm sure, Presiding Officer, that nobody in the chamber this afternoon will be surprised to hear that the research highlights the link between the areas of higher levels of deprivation and the impact of welfare reform. Or to put it more bluntly, the result of these welfare reforms is that the poorest areas will get poorer. It has been understood that the biggest impact of welfare reform on an area basis will be felt in Glasgow. The research figures indicate that impact as being £279 million a year, or £690 for every working-age adult. Across the UK, this puts Glasgow second only to Birmingham in terms of absolute financial loss, and 23rd out of 379 districts in terms of average loss per working adult. As I said this morning...
Mr Rennie.
I thank the member for giving way. Many of the witnesses that gave evidence to the committee did say that they supported some reform. Did the committee look at what types of reform that the committee would prefer to see?
Mr McMahon.
Again this morning, I'm coming on to the evidence that we took this morning, and again a lot of witnesses said this morning that they understood that the system had to be reformed, it had to be streamlined. No one was disputing the fact that something that's 60 years old may not be fit for purpose in the modern era. I don't think that's the argument that any of us have ever had. But to be fair to the committee, what we've done in the first year is working towards identifying a picture of where the impact of the changes is going to fall. The actual changes that are being taken through at the moment are being led by the Scottish Government in response to the welfare reform changes, because a lot of the information, or a lot of the issues that have to be dealt with are devolved here. And the committee has been very encouraged by the positive nature of the regulations and changes that the Scottish Government have brought forward. So yes, we've looked at what changes can be made so far. We've built up a picture of what the impact is going to be, And I can assure you, based on the evidence that we heard this morning at the committee, we will be making recommendations as we move forward as to where more mitigation could come from, and we will continue to criticise the Welfare Reform Act as it goes through when we see the impact that it's having on people. As I said, I wanted to come on at this point to talk about just some of them. Unfortunately, this morning's evidence session was an informal one. It wasn't televised, it wasn't officially recorded. But it was open to the public, and the media were there. The reaction that we've had from the members of the public and the media who were there this morning, I think, will make very difficult reading for people tomorrow morning in their newspapers. To hear a woman break down in tears, talking about having to eke out her money by eating toast for a week because of the money she's going to lose on the bedroom tax, I think would leave anyone who was in Glasgow this morning, who last week could shed a tear, might actually have found the space this morning to shed a tear for that woman as well. We also heard from people with learning disabilities, people who have steady, supported lifestyles at the present time, a married couple both with learning disabilities, who are now fearful of losing their home, having the support that they've depended on and rely on taken away from them. For anyone not to be moved by what we heard this morning and not to want to see changes to the welfare reforms that are being implemented, I think would be beyond anyone's measure. So yes, we will be wanting to bring forward suggestions, because to hear the witness after witness talking about their individual experiences, and then to see the research report that we have, which shows just how widespread this is going to be, not just in Scotland but across the United Kingdom, demands that we look for alternatives, demands that we look to see where we can have change. So I'll close, Presiding Officer, by using the words of Marlene Hepburn, who appeared before the committee earlier this year. When asked what questions she would put to Ian Duncan-Smith if she had the opportunity, Marlene responded, "Where is his heart and where is his sense?" Look at the findings of this research and the impact that welfare reform will have on the most vulnerable in our society. It's difficult to find an answer to that question. How helpful it would be if the Secretary of State would actually show some respect that is due to this Parliament and the people of Scotland, and appear before the Welfare Reform Committee, could provide some answers. So if members on the opposite benches have got any influence at all, they might want to impress upon their colleague at Westminster the need for him to actually come and talk to us about the evidence that we've heard from people that I've already outlined and those that we heard from this morning. If he was to do that, it might change his views. But in the meantime, I'll leave it at that by moving motion S4M 06244 on behalf of the Welfare Reform Committee.
I now call on the Cabinet Secretary, Nicola Sturgeon. 9 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The motion asks us to note the Welfare Reform Committee's second report, the impact of welfare reform on Scotland. For the Government's part, I am very happy to note the report, and I very much welcome the report and indeed the work of the committee in general as a very valuable contribution to what is a growing body of evidence on the dreadful and, as we have just heard at times, heartbreaking impact of the UK Government's welfare reform agenda. The independent experts from Sheffield Hallam University have reached very much the same conclusion as the Scottish Government reached when we carried out our own analysis on the vast sums being taken out, not just of the pockets of already vulnerable and hard-pressed individuals in Scotland, but the vast sums being taken out of the local economies right across Scotland as a result of these reforms. The numbers, to be frank, are alarming. Professors Beattie and Fothergill find that when the reforms take full effect, they will take more than £1.6 billion a year out of the Scottish economy. And that doesn't tell...
Willie Rennie?
She talks about the £1.6 billion that's highlighted in the report. Does that mean she's opposed to all of those reforms? Because that's what would be implied from what she said.
If Willie Rennie, as a supporter of the UK Government that is implementing these welfare reforms, would perhaps care to listen to the speech I'm about to make, then he might learn something about the impact of these reforms on ordinary people right across Scotland. Because I was coming on to talk about one of the changes that is not included in the Sheffield-Hallam research, and that's the decision by the Chancellor in the June 2010 budget of changing the uprating of benefits from RPI to CPI. That would raise the £1.6 billion figure to £2 billion. And over the 5 years to 2015, the total of that impact will be £4.5 billion taken out of the pockets of people working hard on low incomes, families, people with a disability, social housing tenants, people in other vulnerable circumstances. And can I say to Gavin Brown, before he gets up and starts talking about the ability or otherwise of an independent Scotland, in Scotland, if we were independent, then payments to pay for welfare and social protection would be a smaller percentage of our overall wealth. In other words, more affordable, not less affordable, so we wouldn't have to be subjected to the policies of a Tory government that we don't vote for. Yes, I'll take your intervention.
Gavin Brown.
To her for giving way eventually. The change to CPI is the largest individual make-up, as her paper shows. Is there a clear commitment from the Scottish Government to reverse the CPI decision if welfare were to be devolved?
Well, is that an argument from Gavin Brown that we should have those powers? Because if he wants to argue for those powers, then I'm happy to put forward and will be happy to put forward the policies of the Scottish Government for an independent election when we can make the choices that are in the interest of the people we represent, not choices imposed upon us. No, I'm going to make some progress. £4.5 billion out of the pockets of the poorest in our country. In other words, hitting people that society should be helping, not harming, people that we should be protecting, not pillaging. It is absolutely shocking, and the committee's report is a reminder of how the UK Government is penalising the poorest in our society, and even worse than that, failing to give us the full picture. Michael McMahon is absolutely right to say how utterly shocking and unacceptable it is that the UK ministers who are imposing these changes will not come and sit before, in public session, the Welfare Reform Committee and justify these decisions. Both this report and the Scottish Government's report are based on information from a variety of publicly available sources, and they tell a story that the DWP doesn't want people to hear, because they prefer to peddle the myth of scroungers and scrivers instead of focusing on the story that is playing out right across Scotland right now, whether it's on changes to tax credits, whether it's changes to child benefit, no longer a universal bond from one generation to the next, now a muddle of confusion and unfairness, whether it's changes that we've just heard about to disability benefits, or whether, and perhaps most seriously to date, it's the bedroom tax. Now, we've talked a lot in this chamber about the bedroom tax, and there's two fundamental points I want to make about that policy today. One is about fairness, and one is about the differing circumstances in different areas of the country. The other general point is about respect for devolution and the policy responsibilities of the various administrations, because it is clear from this policy that the UK Government has respect neither for fairness nor for the principles of devolution. The bedroom tax, as we've discussed many times, is patently unfair. It's a policy designed to constrain out-of-control housing benefit in London, but which will wreak havoc on the rest of the country. Now, if you look at the last 10 years in the social rented sector in Scotland, housing benefit expenditure has increased by only 6%. The bill for Great Britain as a whole went up by 53% in the same period. So the vast majority, 93% of the increase, is attributable to England, and almost a third of that is attributable to London. So the picture is dominated by London and the South East, and yet we are being asked to pay the price for a policy that has nothing to do with the situation in Scotland. I have to make some progress. So it's clear that the UK Government is using national policy to address a localised issue. Now, I don't like this. I'm not telling anybody here anything they don't know. I don't like the fact that welfare is reserved to the UK Government, but that is the situation at the moment. But the blunt tool of the bedroom tax cuts right across our devolved policy responsibility for housing. So quite apart from the rights and wrongs of the policy, and frankly I can't see many rights of that policy, it's not in my view, for the UK Government to intervene on housing issues in the devolved context, because it's making it more difficult for the Scottish Government to deliver on its housing responsibilities. And the reforms call into question the role of support for housing in a civilised country. Access to decent housing is a fundamental need and right. That should go without saying, but it needs to be said because this UK Government is eroding our capacity to deliver. Now, the Scottish Government, as I have said on many occasions, is doing everything we can to help mitigate the impact of these changes. £2.5 million made available for social landlords to provide the advice and information that they are going to need to give tenants affected by these reforms. That's on top of the £5.4 million that the Government committed for advice and information in respect of welfare reform more broadly. Part of that, an advice fund for providers in the third sector and local government, and the rest directly supporting key advice bodies like Citizens Advice Scotland. We've introduced council tax reductions to replace council tax benefit, and with local government providing an extra £40 million to close the gap caused by the cut of the UK Government. We set up the Scottish Welfare Fund, another key strand of our activity to make sure that we are doing everything we can for the most vulnerable across Scotland. So we will continue to do everything we can to mitigate the impact of these changes that we don't support. But, Presiding Officer, the fact of the matter is that for as long as welfare powers do remain in the hands of the Westminster Government rather than in the hands of this Parliament, then we will be at the mercy of policies that we don't support, imposed by UK governments that we don't vote for. That's the situation we need to address. We do need power over welfare in this Parliament so that we don't only have the option of looking to where we can mitigate, but so that we do have the option, and I say this to those on the Tory and Liberal benches, so that we do have the option to make the choices and the decisions here that allow us to have a welfare state that meets our needs and meets the values that we hold dear. So I'm happy to support this motion today, and I look forward to the day when we no longer have to debate welfare policies imposed by another government, but when we have responsibility here in our own Parliament.
Thank you. I'll call on Jackie Bailey. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I too very much welcome the opportunity to debate welfare reform and its impact in Scotland. And I commend the Welfare Reform Committee on their work, in particular highlighting the research from Sheffield Hallam University, so that we begin to understand the scale of the challenge facing us. Now, the report estimates that £1.6 billion will be taken from the pockets of some of our poorest people and indeed from the Scottish economy, equivalent to £480 a year for every working-age adult. The worst affected, though, are the disabled, with reforms to income capacity benefit resulting in something like £500 million per year, never mind the impact of the other benefit reforms that will affect them, such as the bedroom tax. And then come those who are the working poor, with changes that cut £300 million a year from tax credits, and the list goes on. Now, I have no problem with reforming the welfare system. It is overly complicated and bureaucratic. Many of us will indeed recall the forms the size of telephone books that people required to complete. But what the Tories and the Lib Dems are doing is not deserving of the name reform. It is nothing more than a smokescreen for cuts. A 10% cut in council tax benefit, a 20% cut in incapacity benefits, just to give two examples. And for the Tories to suggest that the greatest burden for the country's recovery will be borne by those with the broadest shoulders is clearly arrant nonsense. Because let's not forget that this is the month that the Tories awarded their 13,000 millionaire pals a tax break of £100,000 more each year, as 250,000 children across the country are pushed into poverty. These changes have a disproportionate impact on women and children, as women make up the majority of those claiming benefits. I was surprised that 70% of tax credits are claimed by women, 60% of housing benefit claimed by women. Now, I know that some in this chamber will only see the challenge in the context of the Constitution, but Sheffield Hallam's research has some interesting things to say. Firstly, they conclude that Scotland hasn't been in any way singled out. The impact of the reforms is broadly in line with the UK average, and indeed the problem is worse in the North East of England, the North West of England, the Midlands, Yorkshire, London and Wales. Nevertheless, the scale of the impact is still substantial. But perhaps the lesson for us in this chamber is that we should make common cause with people in Newcastle, Manchester, Birmingham, Liverpool, rather than this simply being an issue that's about the Constitution. But secondly, the most deprived areas of Scotland are hit the hardest. So Glasgow, Inverclyde, Dundee and Western Berkshire will have some of the biggest challenges to face in trying to protect their most vulnerable communities. And I am interested in exploring how we can assist them in doing that. But, Presiding Officer, this mustn't be an abstract debate.
Willie Rennie.
The member talked about not being opposed to reforms, but what kind of reforms would she envisage that she wasn't able to deliver in 13 years in government?
Jackie Baillie.
Frankly, not the reforms that attack the poorest and most vulnerable in our society by being a smokescreen for cuts. And it mustn't be an abstract debate, because Willie Rennie is well aware that the consequences are already being felt. On 1 April, responsibility for council tax benefit was devolved, together with responsibility for community care grants and crisis grants. And on council tax benefit, whilst there is an arrangement in place for this year to share the cost with local government, COSLA is already saying that they will not be able to fund this next year. So will the Scottish Government plug the gap fully? And with community care grants and crisis grants, anecdotal evidence already suggests that local authorities are worried about meeting the demand. And in an area like Western Berkshire, they're expecting 2,000 additional claims to be made, and the funds that they have will be insufficient to meet all of that demand. So what happens, Presiding Officer, when the money runs out before the end of the year? Does the Scottish Government have a plan B? And whilst we're on the subject, why has the Scottish Government not put in place a Social Fund Commissioner to deal with appeals? Because surely that is against ECHR principles. And of course, Presiding Officer, the much reviled bedroom tax was also introduced. Again, despite increasing the size of their discretionary housing pot by the maximum allowed, it looks as if that will be insufficient, not just in Western Berkshire, but many local authority areas, to protect the most vulnerable affected. And you know, when the Tories say that people should just move house, they display a total misunderstanding of the housing market. Western Berkshire alone is short by 1,000 one-bedroom houses. So where have people to move to? And, Presiding Officer, whilst we recognise that blame does lie with the Tories and the Liberal Democrats, people will look to the Scottish Government to mitigate the worst impact of welfare reform. The action on passported benefits and council tax benefit is welcome, but it is a small drop in the ocean. Even now, at this late stage, legislation to protect tenants from eviction and funding to help housing associations and councils would provide a lifeline to those impacted by the bedroom tax. You know, even guidance would help local authorities. But the Cabinet Secretary must listen to the academics writing today in the Herald about the importance of intervention to stop families and communities being broken up. They recognise that money is tight, and they make the point that the council tax freeze is regressive. It helps the richest in our society the most. Their suggestion is to end the freeze, which would help to pay for the cuts to welfare. It would help some of the most vulnerable in our society. A radical suggestion may be, but it merits consideration, because the consequences of doing nothing will be devastating. In closing, Presiding Officer, it is times like these that devolution was created for. It is the very worst kind of politics to tell people to simply wait for some indeterminate time in the future when you have the power to help them now. The SNP must use the powers they have, because the poorest people cannot afford to wait.
Thank you. Now Colin Alec Johnson, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I begin by saying a few words about the nature of this report, and just to clarify that this is in effect a piece of independent research and that it should not be confused with a report that has been approved by the committee. I am prepared to accept the report in that it is independent research which has been published, but I will question some of the terms that are contained within it. And the one that I will question first of all is the notion that somehow the welfare reform process process or the benefit changes takes £1.6 billion out of the Scottish economy. Well, perhaps it takes that out, but we have to take into account the fact that in the round, the changes that are taking place, and particularly the changes in tax threshold, which will see the tax threshold reach £10,000 in April of next year, means that for Scotland's working poor, and I am concerned about them, many of them will be lifted substantially out of tax by these changes. And the net effect means that many of those who lose a little on benefits, who are in work, will be gaining substantially in tax not paid. And I think the report fails to recognise that key balance. However, there are one or two things in the report which I do find particularly valuable. And one is that it makes very clear, for anyone who may have thought rather differently, that there is in fact no difference in how this change affects Scotland as opposed to England. Those who might have wished to argue that it gave some disadvantage to Scotland will have that particular fault shot from them by this report, where it says the scale of loss in Scotland, measured per adult of working age, is broadly on a par with the GP average. Overall, the welfare reforms hit Scotland less than Northern England or Wales, but more than Southern England, for example. And that indicates to me that anyone who uses this as an argument for Scottish independence is trying to construct something which is not actually viable. What it does do, which is also very useful to us, is indicate that the change will be much more noticeable within Scotland rather than between Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom. And it says, within Scotland, however, the local authorities covering the poorest areas are hit hardest. As a general rule, the more deprived the local authority, the greater the fiscal hit, which indicates, as we all suspected, that the culture of welfare dependency, which we unfortunately have to deal with in Scotland, is one that has a very strong geographical basis. However, as we listen to the progress of this debate, there are several anomalies which arise. First of all, the process of the have your say process, which the committee has engaged in, has substantially managed to find people who have had significant difficulties with the benefits system. However, the vast majority of those who come forward are talking about issues that predate the introduction of the government's welfare reform process on the 1st of April this year. In fact, the irony is that many of the problems these individuals have encountered have been as a result of reforms in the benefit process which predate this Conservative Liberal Democrat government altogether and are in fact changes introduced by the previous Labour government. And that brings us to the challenge. And that is, if we are to talk about welfare reform in the Scottish context, we cannot do it in a vacuum. We cannot be in a situation where those who oppose the progress in Scotland simply say, we oppose change. Because the fashion used to be to say that welfare reform is necessary, but it could be done a different way. And yet, in this debate so far, as with previous debates, no one has suggested how they might do it differently. And unless we are prepared to talk in these terms, we are making no progress in this debate. And Labour and the SNP are both good at it, and they do it in different ways. Of course, Labour have one view in Scotland, but apparently south of the border they have a rather different view. I just happened to see Caroline Flint MP on Question Time last Thursday night, and an interesting discussion it was that took place on the issue of benefit reform, where, on the subject of the benefits cap, she didn't object to the benefits cap at all. In fact, her only objection was that it applied UK-wide. She was of the belief that the benefits cap should be much, much higher in London, where it's more expensive to live, and consequently people need more money. I think that view is wholly inconsistent with the view alluded at by the Labour Party in Scotland. And for that reason, we need the Labour Party in Scotland to tell us what their view is on these subjects and how it would apply. But let me now turn to the Scottish National Party. Of course, it suits their purpose to argue that benefit reform in Scotland is a bad thing and it would be a different process if Scotland was independent. Yet, we hear a lot of figures bandied about. There's the cost of £1.6 billion that's mentioned in this report. There could be £2.5 billion. It could be the £4.5 billion, which is mentioned by the Cabinet Secretary in her opening speech. But what this report makes it very clear is that if Scotland was ever to put that level of money into benefits, then it would be as a function of redistribution within the Scottish economy. And if that £1.6, £2.5 or £4.5 billion has to be found in Scotland, it has to be found from areas of the economy which currently could do well to avoid that additional level of taxation. So my challenge to the Minister is that before this debate comes to an end, she will explain to us exactly who will pay the tax to pay the benefits and exactly how much extra tax will have to be paid.
Thank you very much. Now call on Annabel Ewing as we move to open debate, to be followed by Ian Gray.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I am pleased indeed to have been called to speak in this Welfare Reform Committee debate this afternoon. And whilst I am a member of the Welfare Reform Committee, I am of course speaking in a capacity not on behalf of the committee. I feel it's important to say that at the moment. As we have heard thus far, we are looking at the excellent report commissioned by the Scottish Parliament on behalf of the Welfare Reform Committee, prepared by Professor Steve Fothergill and Professor Christina Beattie, both of Sheffield Hallam University. And the committee indeed had the pleasure of speaking directly with Professor Fothergill at its evidence session last week, and of making further inquiries in an evidence session about the report itself. And at the outset, it is important to note that the report makes no comment on the merits or otherwise of the UK Government's welfare reforms. And rather, as Professor Fothergill said, the report is about tracking the impact of the reforms on Scotland as a whole and on each of the constituent local authorities in Scotland. And another important point to note, Presiding Officer, is that the figures in the report are, again to quote Professor Fothergill, rooted in official UK Government statistics, a point perhaps that Alex Ferguson was not paying attention to last week at the committee. And yet another important point to note is that the report does not cover the move from the retail prices index to the CPI for uprating. And again, Professor Fothergill explained his rationale here, and he said that that is a much wider public sector accounting reform that affects a wide range of public sector pensions as well as benefits. So the report's key conclusion that we have heard about already this afternoon, to the effect that the UK Government welfare reforms will take more than £1.6 billion a year out of the Scottish economy, should be seen against the backdrop of the parameters of this report. But it is also clear that this figure represents not simply a significant impact on individuals, estimated to be around £480 a year, but also a significant loss of spending power in our local communities, a point also recognised by the report. And what is also important to note here is that the impact will be felt not just by those who are not in work, but of course by those who are working. And Professor Fothergill referred expressly to that point in his evidence to the committee last week, where he said, let us not slip into the assumption that the welfare reforms all impact on claimants who are out of work. So what does all this mean, Presiding Officer, for the people of Scotland? Well, I believe that the report makes very grim reading indeed, both for those out of work and for those in work, where changes, for example, to tax credits and the 1% uprating cap will have a particular impact for many households. And it won't just be a tax affecting a household or individual. It will not just be then, for example, the bedroom tax, but it may be, I won't just now thank you, but it may be the bedroom tax, the cuts to disability benefit, the cuts to child benefit, and the list indeed goes on. And as we know from the recent Scottish Government report already referred to, the cumulative impact over the next period of years is expected to be some £4.5 billion, and that is a vast sum, Presiding Officer, that will be taken out of our economy over the next years. And that, of course, represents a hammer blow to the individuals concerned, amongst whom, of course, are some of the most vulnerable members of our society. And indeed, Presiding Officer, we heard, I won't just now thank you, from our convener, Michael McMahon, already this afternoon, that further to our session this morning in Glasgow, which I'm afraid Mr Ferguson didn't manage to make, Mr Johnson, I've done that twice, I'm sorry, I've just realised that, excuse me for that, but we heard from some of the most vulnerable people this morning in our further use say evidence session, and indeed it was a very powerful evidence session. And we heard, for example, from a lady, Anne Bradley, who, being faced with the bedroom tax, was told, well, you can take in a lodger, she was told. And Anne Bradley then posed the question, why should anyone have to take a stranger into their home? And I think that is a very good question. Another example was posed by a vulnerable adult in terms of who is in receipt currently of local authority support, but because of the vagaries of the UK system that has been introduced, they will not receive the exemption in terms of the supported accommodation exemption because their support provider is not their landlord. And we also heard from a lady, Agnes Allen, who was very worried about the future for her disabled daughter, who has been striving to lead as independent a life as possible, is currently in receipt of DLA and is very fearful for her future. And when I asked of this lady, presiding officer, if she felt that UK government ministers in any way walked in the shoes of people like herself, her reply was, no, they do not walk in our shoes, they are stealing our shoes. Presiding officer, it is simply unacceptable to me that we are witnessing the decimation of our welfare system and the removal of the safety net. That is the mark of a civilised society. And the only way we can change that path is by securing here for this Parliament powers over the welfare system. And I see Jackie Bailey smirking, but that is not an abstract issue, as she seemed to suggest in her remarks. It is quite the reverse, because surely politics, above all, is about power. It is about the power to change society for the better. If you don't have the power, you can't do that. And I'm sorry, I'm in my last 30 seconds. So the only way that we can ensure that we do not see £4.5 billion taken out of our economy, with our most vulnerable people hammered by the UK Tory government in London, is to take control ourselves. And it is a shame. It is a shame that Labour seem to prefer to gamble with the possibility of one day a Labour government being elected in London and with, therefore, in the interim, welfare controlled by a Tory government, rather than see this Parliament do what we need to do to ensure that the values of our citizens are protected. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Now call on Ian Gray to be followed by Bob Doris. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The Welfare Reform Committee hear about the impact of these reforms every week. We hear it from academics, notably in the Sheffield Hallam research, which many speakers have referred to. We hear it from a wide variety of agencies with an interest, advice agencies, who tell us that they are overwhelmed by the need for advice, by advocates of those affected, for example, people with disabilities, those who suffer mental health problems, or those who are poor. And they tell us they are overwhelmed by the severity of the impact those they work with tell them is happening. We hear it from service providers, such as local authorities and housing associations, and they too are overwhelmed by the impossibility of the position they find themselves in. But the most powerful testimony is from the individuals and families affected themselves, as we heard today in Glasgow, as the convener described. And they are overwhelmed by the injustice of these reforms, the fear they are provoking for them, and the cruelty they promise. And this is not even being cruel to be kind, because it is clear from the evidence the committee has heard that these reforms will not have the effect that they are designed to, whether that is about moving people into work or into smaller tenancies. Of course, the committee don't just collect testimony, but they also seek to look at ways of mitigating the impact of these reforms and to scrutinise the government's actions to that end. So we have considered the Scottish Welfare Fund, the new passporting regulations and the council tax reduction replacing council tax benefit. Now, none of these are perfect. For example, Jackie Bailey mentioned the issue around appeals. But I have to say that in every case, the Scottish Government has clearly and in good faith set out to try and create a system in which there is no significant loss to those who depend on those benefits. And in two cases, the Welfare Fund and council tax reduction, they have indeed identified additional resource, £9 million for the Welfare Fund and £40 million between themselves and councils when it comes to council tax reduction. But much of the attention currently has been focused around the bedroom tax, and rightly so, because this really is a reform which cannot work. The committee has heard evidence from housing associations, for example from Albion Housing Association in the Highlands and Islands, who explained that 75% of all their properties have 2 or 3 bedrooms, and over 30% of their tenants are affected by these changes. They simply do not have single-bedroom houses in the small communities they serve, and so this cannot work as designed to move people into smaller tenancies and free up the bigger ones for others. And this morning in Glasgow we heard of a particularly pernicious effect on people with learning disability, people who we have worked hard to liberate from long-stay institutions to live with support in their own tenancies, where they now find themselves punished by this bedroom tax. Now, my colleague and friend Andrew Burns at the City of Edinburgh Council has said that Labour and the SNP should be able to work together in fighting this bedroom tax. And I think he is right. And indeed, there is less division, I think, than some portray, for example, when it comes to council policies. The committee heard from Councillor Black, SNP from Dundee, and Councillor McCabe from North Lanarkshire, Labour councillor, of course. And they talked about their attitude to eviction as a result of the bedroom tax. Councillor Black said that their no eviction policy meant that if a tenant had arrears only due to the bedroom tax and had done everything possible to avoid it and hadn't been offered a smaller tenancy, the council would use all forms of debt recovery but not eviction for a year. Councillor McCabe said that they would do everything possible short of eviction, but he couldn't promise that it would never come to that. I think they were saying exactly the same thing. And to pretend otherwise, I think, is really to split hairs at the margin of the problem. Because the trouble with the no eviction policy, of course, is it provides no protection for housing association tenants. It secondly means that tenants, even if they avoid eviction, will still carry the debt of their rent arrears into their future. And thirdly, it provides no help for those who find some way, God knows how, to actually pay the bedroom tax, perhaps by heating less or eating less or depriving their kids more. And they deserve help and mitigation too. I believe the only way to mitigate this iniquitous tax is to find some or all of the resource to offset the housing benefit reduction, not through providing advice, but directly through discretionary housing payments, Section 12 payments or otherwise. I don't say that we should be anything but clear who is responsible for this iniquitous tax. It is the UK Government. And it isn't fair that we should have to try and find additional resources from within our budgets, but then it isn't fair that some of our most vulnerable citizens have to find the bedroom tax from within their resources too. Solidarity, rather than sympathy, demands that we don't just point a finger at the guilty, but stretch out a helping hand to the victims too. I know that something will have to be cut to do that, but that is the consensus we must reach, finding a budget adjustment which might be less than ideal, but we can both, on most sides of this Parliament, support. Otherwise, we are not doing all that we can. The truth is that we must share some of the pain here in order to avoid sharing some of the guilt.
Thank you very much. Now call on Bob Doris to be followed by Willie Rennie. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Presiding Officer, can I start by thanking the Welfare Reform Committee for the ongoing scrutiny that they are providing. I sat on the Health and Sport Committee when we first scrutinised welfare reform within that committee, and it was clear our committee believed that such was the tidal wave of negative impacts that were going to hit Scotland in relation to welfare reform that there had to be a standalone committee in this Parliament. I think history will show that, irrespective of more powers that come to this Parliament, that is a committee we will need for the long term to analyse, scrutinise welfare and benefits in this country, and I thank all the members for their hard work. I think the Sheffield Hallam report on the impact of welfare reform makes very sobering reading indeed. As we have heard, it estimates that £1.6 billion will be lost to many of the most vulnerable Scots each year by these reforms. Every local authority will suffer, but for my constituents in Glasgow, they will suffer more than most. In absolute terms and in per capita terms, Glaswegians will be hit more than any other area. Glasgow, as a council, will be hit more than any other area. In my opinion, this is a brutal attack by the UK Government on the very people that all governments have got a duty to support where they can. Presiding Officer, my constituents ask me how the Scottish Government, how the Scottish Parliament can protect them from this attack. They ask what we can do to help. And the bedroom tax does feature prominently in the list of concerns my constituents have. However, they do also mention to me a variety of other changes, which include the abolition of disability living allowance and the move to personal independence payments, as well as the reform to incapacity benefit. Those two actions alone will affect around 200,000 households and take up to, if combined in the same household, £6,500 away from individual households right across Scotland. And again, it will impact more on my constituents than anywhere else in Scotland. Last night, Presiding Officer, I attended one of the initial meetings to establish the Greater Maryhill Food Bank in the north of Glasgow. It aims to provide families in financial and food crisis with only 3 days left of non-perishable food provisions in their homes and no way of getting additional food with the support they need. That's a response to real food hunger currently in Maryhill, as welfare reform continues on that process. The initiative was actually inspired by local police as key stakeholders. They don't want to spend their time seeking to prosecute vulnerable individuals who commit crime due to poverty. They want to be chasing real criminals. I heard the story last night about a police van that was driving around Maryhill going towards an unrelated event to the incident I'm about to tell you about, where there was a number of police officers inside and they saw a young guy running out of the Lidl supermarket in Maryhill and being chased by a security officer. So the van pulled up, cornered the guy who ran into a garden and was found under a bush. The guy stolen a bar of chocolate. The guy was actually not stealing the bar of chocolate for petty pilfering. The guy hadn't eaten for a number of days. Not my story, but the story the local community police shared with us at the Greater Maryhill Food Bank meeting last night. That can't be right, but it's going to get a lot worse. I fully accept that these are a tiny minority cases at present, but I don't think it will stay a tiny minority cases for long if we can't do something about this. So I'm delighted that housing associations, churches, charities, community councils, youth groups and others are coming together to address this situation. Not something they should have to address, because it's up to the state to address these things, but something they are compelled by their community spirit and solidarity to do what they can to support. I've got constituents who are being asked to move out of their homes right now, their own communities, in order that their housing benefits will meet their rent. Local links destroyed, support networks broken, childcare provision wrecked and lives placed in turmoil. And that is, of course, if another property is available. Often it is not. In many cases, even where a property is available, families will still, for very understandable reasons, not feel able to move. In Glasgow, the SNP opposition group are seeking to get the Labour-run council to increase the amount that is in the Housing Benefit Discretionary Fund by the maximum permitted by legislation by 2.5 times. The shortfall in Glasgow in housing benefit is around £10 million per year, with the discretionary fund from the UK being under £3 million. I very much hope that the Council will listen to the constructive representations from the SNP on this matter and urge them, if they can, to increase it by the maximum allowed. That would be a form of mitigation, and we've already heard a number of forms of mitigation by the Scottish Government, whether it was the £9 million in the Welfare Fund, whether it's the £40 million with our local authority partners on council tax benefit or money-to-money advice services. But the council tax, Presiding Officer, is £50 million per annum cut from Scotland's most vulnerable people, out of a total £1.6 billion cut from Scotland's most vulnerable people. Can we get real, Presiding Officer? Calls to plug every gap from the UK
Must
government
close,
and to
please.
tax on the most vulnerable. People are deceiving themselves or deceiving the people of Scotland. Only tax and benefits to this Parliament with full independence will ever protect our most vulnerable people in
You
Scotland.
must close. Thank you. Now call on Willie Rennie to be followed by George Adam.
I try not to make a habit of it, but I happened to read a press statement from Jamie Hepburn this morning, and I advise members not to make a habit of it. But he said Labour is terrified of saying anything substantial on welfare. Now, myself and my colleagues in the Conservative Party have asked numerous times this afternoon for members to come forward with their own ideas about welfare reform. And although they all say they're in favour and they're not opposed, not one idea has come forward for welfare reform. So, just in a second, I will be happy to take an intervention from Mr Stewart, because this is an opportunity. I am quite happy to give up all of my 6 minutes for people to tell me what reforms they are going to make and how much they will save. And we could start with Kevin Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I thank Mr Rennie for giving way. One of the things which could be done to cut out the bureaucracy and the amount of money that is going to Atos to carry out work capability assessments would be if the Secretary of State or Lord Freud actually designated vulnerable people who should not have to go through constant assessments. That is one way of saving yourselves some money and also saving some of these folk from going through constant pain.
Willie Rennie.
That sounds like costing more money, not less money. Yes, Linda Fabiani. Yes,
Linda Fabiani.
Mr Rennie, another idea. That idea would be one we heard this morning, which is where there is people in supported accommodation who have to pay bedroom tax. Perhaps the criteria should be that where councils are administering care packages, these people should be exempt.
Yeah.
Well, an exemption sounds like it costs money. And although these things are all valid, and I would debate these issues, Mark MacDonald, go on, give me another one.
Mark MacDonald.
Mr Rennie assumes that welfare reform exists within a bubble. Is he aware of the tax avoidance bill that is faced by the UK, and does he not agree that perhaps diverting more effort towards catching those people avoiding tax rather than punishing those on benefits might help to pay for some of these extra costs he claims are being identified?
Very commendable. In fact, Danny Alexander has invested more in trying to close these loopholes and catch these people. But it is not welfare. It is not welfare reform that he has suggested. So 3 members intervened. 3 members, not one single idea to save money. They live in a complete bubble. They do not understand the consequences. Yes, Drew Smith. Let's see if he's got anything.
Okay, Drew Smith.
Mr Rennie, I'm grateful, Presiding Officer, I'm grateful to Mr Rennie for giving way, but doesn't he understand that, particularly on the bedroom tax, it's just as one example, the welfare reforms that the UK Government are making would actually cost more money. Because if you're going to evict people from their homes, where do you think they are going to be rehoused? Who is going to pick up the tab for those evictions and for finding new homes for those individuals? Your savings are not savings at all.
So 4 suggestions, no suggestions for saving. Now, I understand the difficulties with the bedroom tax. Just a second. Let me answer this one before I come to Mr Harvey. It will take up the 6 minutes. Mr Smith has not identified a saving. He's identified something he would like to change with a welfare reform programme. If we can come up with any ideas, because the members, just in a second, because the members have highlighted that the impact on Scotland would be £1.6 billion. That implies we would reverse all £1.6 billion worth of savings. The bedroom tax is £50 million. £50 million out of £1.6 billion. So even if we acceded to what Mr Smith is alluding to, it would only save a fraction of what the UK Government is planning to do. Yes, Mr Harvey, let's see if he can come up with something.
I'm grateful for all of the willingness from Mr Rennie to listen to suggestions. If he is opposing the criticisms of the bedroom tax on the basis that it won't save money, will he at least acknowledge that rent controls in the private rented sector would be a much more effective way of reducing the housing benefit bill in areas where private rents have gone spiralling out of control and where it's landlords, a small proportion of exploitative landlords, who are milking the system, and it wouldn't hurt the tenants?
Rennie, 90 seconds.
That is certainly something that's worthy of consideration, but he needs to be aware of the balance between encouraging people to invest in the private rented sector that's trying to improve its standards and rent controls. These things are not a one-way street. You need to consider these things in the round. So we have had 5 interventions from members, but not one single suggestion. Because I believe in welfare reform. I believe in making work pay. I believe in trying to get the budget under control. But I also believe, and this is an important principle, that it is a safety net for those who are in need. But what it does not help is for members in this chamber to constantly complain about the changes, but come up with not one single change themselves that will actually save money. Not one single change. Not one single change that will save money. If they can't commit to reforms, these are just spineless complaints that are not actually reflecting the needs of people who are in need. I have been working to deal with issues like the bedroom tax, as Mr Smith says. I've been working on these issues. I've probably had more discussions on the bedroom tax than almost anybody in this Parliament. So I'm aware, fully aware, I've met lots of people who are anxious about the reforms. But what politicians cannot run away from is their responsibilities to the welfare state and to those people who are in need.
Close, please. Thank you very much. Now call on George Adam to be followed by Anne McTaggart. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I first welcome the work of the Welfare Reform Committee and commend them in bringing this debate to the Chamber. Although I'm not a member of the committee, I'm keen on the work that they're doing and the scrutiny that they bring to this important issue. Many MSPs will only be too aware of the worry and potential financial hardships that these so-called welfare reforms will bring to families throughout our constituencies and regions that we represent. As the Cabinet Secretary has already said, when these welfare reforms are in full effect, they will take £1.6 billion per year out of the Scottish economy. In towns and villages across our country, that will have a dramatic effect within our high streets because it tends to be the old, the infirm and the unemployed who still actually shop and spend money in our local areas. So I would say that this is something we have to take into account. But next week, Presiding Officer, yes, OK then.
Can I just mention that when he was talking about the old there, that those of pensionable age, these restrictions and changes don't actually apply?
The old, I was actually saying that they're some of the people, the demographic that still shop within our kind of high streets. But next week, Presiding Officer, will be Multiple Sclerosis Awareness Week, and I have to admit I do have a bit of emotional baggage when it comes to this issue because it's very close to my heart. I'm a member of the MS Society in Paisley and District Branch, and I know many of the individuals that these so-called reforms will affect. As you'll be aware, Presiding Officer, MS is the most common disabling neurological condition affecting young adults, and more than 10,500 people in Scotland have MS. And the welfare changes that are targeted will be felt almost exclusively by people of working age, as the majority of people are diagnosed with MS between the ages of 20 and 40. So people with MS in Scotland are already concerned that their ability to make ends meet, and many will face losing substantial amounts of benefit under the welfare reform changes. The Multiple Sclerosis Society in Scotland's biggest fear, of course, is the changes to disability living allowance. And the Welfare Reforms Committee report already states that 55,000 individuals will be affected by this, and an estimated loss to the economy of £165 million per annum. In my own county of Renfrewshire, the report states that it will affect 2,100 people and £6 million per year. People with MS is a condition that can fluctuate and is different from many individuals, and that's part of the concern when it comes to disability living allowance and the potential changes to PIP, because of the fluctuations, people can be OK one week and have difficulty the next, and a lot of the so-called independent experts involved do not have an understanding of a long-term condition like this. The Personal Independence Panel will go through the assessments very soon, and the key changes will be designed to focus on those with greatest needs. A new objective points-based assessment will be brought in, which is likely to involve face-to-face meeting with an independent healthcare professional. Again, the Society in Scotland have concerns that these individuals may not actually have the expertise to deal with that situation. More than 7,000 people with MS in Scotland currently receive DLA payments, and every single one of them will be affected. People with MS rely on these benefits to manage a wide range of costs, including aids, adaptations and paying for care and support. I would just like to take this stage, Presiding Officer, to mention some of the voices from people with MS, because there are some interesting facts come out of this. One of the people said, "For a person like me, DLA means the difference between surviving and living. It's the difference between having a life and not having a life." That's quite a strong statement in itself. This other one here says, "DLA is spent on ready meals, pre-chopped vegetables, fruit and salads, sandwiches, hair and nail appointments and waxing." Now that sounds as if it's something that shouldn't be used for a benefit, but the individual concerned with MS can no longer dry her hair, cut her nails or shave her legs because she only wishes she could. These are things that that individual has stated that they can't do, and they need that money to do that. Another individual said, "My needs change not just weekly but daily, but often hourly. DLA gives me the freedom to pay for help and when I need it, and it's much more cost-effective and flexible and responsive." So every one of these individuals will have a situation where they will have things will get slowly but surely worse for them. The implications of losing one form of benefit can also have far-reaching consequences. For example, one lady with MS knows that she could be moved onto a lower rate of mobility and will only involve a reduction in the value of her benefit, but it will also remove her right to have a disabled parking badge. So therefore, she would have a difficulty in her day-to-day life to get about her own life and conditions. The assessments fail, as I've already said, to take into account the full range of barriers and costs that people with MS face, particularly failing to account properly for the fluctuation. The current approach assesses whether individuals can undertake activities in the majority of days, and the majority of people with MS this changes on a daily basis. The criteria means that those that are able to walk even slightly further than 2 metres, even using sticks, 20 metres, will not qualify for the enhanced rate of mobility, where currently it's actually 50 metres. That, again, would have an effect on someone with this condition. The type of Scotland that I'm looking at for the future, Presiding Officer, is one. This is only one group of many that this welfare reform will affect. And the 7,000 people with MS who have DLA and the 10,500 Scots and their families who are already dealing with this condition are asking us, what are we going to look for the future and what can we offer? For me, having the full levers of independence will be the way forward for us to actually ensure that we can give these people and these families a future in Scotland.
Thanks. I will now move to Anne McTaggart, to be followed by Mark MacDonald. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I am pleased to have the opportunity to contribute to this debate of huge importance this afternoon, and given the widespread impact of the benefits cuts on some of the most vulnerable people in our communities, I'd like to focus my contribution on the effects of welfare reform on women. Long before the recession of 2008 and before the election of our coalition government in 2010, women were paid less than men, more likely to be unemployed than men, and more often employed in a part-time, temporary role than their male counterparts. The economic crisis and the policies of our governments have caused this inequality to increase, and it is women that are once again suffering disproportionately from the disgraceful welfare reforms inspired by both governments. At this time of struggle and hardship for Scottish families, the removal of key financial assistance is a disaster for those in and out of work, and has proved to be especially damaging for women and the wider pursuit of economic equality. The abolition of health and pregnancy grant means that since January 2011, expectant mothers are £190 worse off and will receive no direct support with financial costs of starting a family. If a woman already has a child under the age of 16, she will no longer receive the £500 Sure Start maternity grant that was available to unemployed working parents and those in low-paid jobs. Child benefit, often paid directly to mothers, will be capped for 3 years, resulting in a loss of over £1,000 for a family with 2 children. Even the statutory maternity pay has been cut in real terms and is likely to be reduced by nearly £300 a year by 2015. At a time when families' budgets are increasingly squeezed, this removal of this kind of assistance has huge impact on efforts to achieve economic equality between the sexes and will increase the dependency of women on other sources of income, often the salary of a male partner. This is unsustainable and does nothing to realise the ambition of a society where women are valued equally to men and are empowered to take control over their own financial affairs. Certainly.
Bob Doris.
I thank Anne McTaggart for giving way. I very much agree with how these cuts will be targeted, particularly upon women. I wonder if you'd agree with me that lone parents will be particularly affected, many of whom, of course, the majority of whom, of course, are women, but not just the lone parents themselves, but also former partners, males who wish to have an active part in their children's life. The bedroom tax will quite often mean they will not have a room for their child to keep that relationship going. So certainly it targets women, but also former partners who would like to take an active part in their children's life.
Absolutely, and I thank Bob Doris for that. I didn't have it within my speech, but thank you for raising that, and I totally agree. All across Scotland, workers are being paid less, businesses are closing down and employers are being made redundant. Families are being forced out of their homes, first-time buyers are priced out of the market and graduates are taught to forget the aspirations that took them to university in the first place. Presiding Officer, this is what devolution was made for. It falls upon this Scottish Government to use the powers that they have and to do all that they can to protect the unemployed and those in low-paid jobs. The draconian cuts to the budgets of local government in Scotland means that the last line of defence to these welfare reforms are outrageously underfunded. Presiding Officer, I urge the Scottish Government to reconsider their short-sighted approach to tackling the welfare reforms of the coalition government and to reflect on the need for proactive responses to benefit cuts that deliver real solutions for ordinary Scottish families. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call Mark MacDonald to be followed by Kezia Douglas.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I don't want to spend the entirety of my speech on the bedroom tax and to get hung up on that, but I want to mention it briefly at the beginning, and it will also come up in one of the case studies I wish to refer to. I received a report from the charity Crisis, the homelessness monitor for December 2012, which was put together by Crisis along with Heriot-Watt University and the University of York. It also highlights two other changes which are being made in the housing sphere, which will have an impact on homelessness in Scotland. The first of those, beyond the bedroom tax, is the extension of the shared accommodation rate of local housing allowance to 25 to 34-year-olds living in the private rented sector, which will increase pressure on a limited supply of shared accommodation and possibly force vulnerable people into inappropriate shared settings, even with the concession for those who have lived in hostels for at least 3 months. The other is the increased conditionality and sanctions associated with the work programme, coupled with the transferring of many vulnerable claimants from sickness benefits into job seekers' allowance, implying the possibility of stringent sanctions applied to vulnerable single homeless people and others with chaotic lifestyles. So wrong just to say that only the bedroom tax is going to have an impact in terms of the homelessness agenda. But in terms of the bedroom tax, one of the interesting things is that because here in Scotland we have ended priority need, we currently have 64% of homeless applications in Scotland coming from single people, as opposed to 25% south of the border. Yet 26% of social housing is one-bedroom properties, which means that people who are homeless will be housed into properties where they will find themselves in the position of being subjected to the bedroom tax. Now, the reason that I take the view that we should not be singling out the bedroom tax in terms of the mitigation process is that there are other benefits out there which people might then wish to see us mitigate, and we would have to make a case for why we could mitigate one yet not another. The reason why we can do it for council tax benefit is because that has been passed in its entirety to the control of this Parliament. At the moment, the bedroom tax remains a reserved imposition on Scotland rather than something that has been transferred to our control. But Drew Smith is correct when he said to Willie Rennie that if this is about saving money, it can only work if people do not relocate. The only way that the bedroom tax can work is if it effectively doesn't work, because if the stated aim of the policy, as put forward by UK ministers, is that it should encourage people to relocate to a smaller property, well then it isn't going to save money, as Mr Rennie alleges that it would. It is simply going to be ineffective in that aim. And Mr Rennie accuses those of us on these benches of being spineless. Now, the reason I know that not to be the case is that if I did lack a spine, I would be getting invited annually to come and see Atos to find if it had grown back and I was therefore capable for work. And that's the process that disabled people are having to go through, as if somehow a miracle will have occurred in the 12 months previous. I've heard tales of people who are effectively in states of childlike intellect because of brain injuries, yet they are constantly invited back as if somehow the brain injury will have gone away in the 12 months since they were last assessed. That, to me, is a bureaucracy which clearly is going to cost money to continue to administer, as well as simply being utterly degrading for the people going through it. But I want to focus on a couple of case studies related to autism, which is an issue that is close to my heart. The first of those relates to the bedroom tax, and I alluded to it in the debate last Thursday, the case of Tracy Mahoney and her sons. Tracy is a Castle Housing Association tenant in Shedixley in Aberdeen. She has two sons. Bradley is 14 and has additional support needs, and Jason is 11 and has autism. They live in a three-bedroomed house which was given to them because their paediatric consultant stated that Jason required a bedroom to himself for behavioural and sleeping issues. But she is now losing £50 a month as a result of the under-occupancy on housing benefit, despite needing that bedroom for Jason as a result of his autism. And today in the Daily Record, we read the story of Sandy McClinsky, a 27-year-old with autism, and his experiences of assessment, not just for DLA, but also for work capability, where the people assessing him admit to him that they have a little understanding of autism and what it entails, and him being put into work situations which are clearly not suitable for individuals with autism. So the welfare reform may well be necessary, but it also is necessary for there to be an understanding of the conditions that people present with in order for them to then be treated as humanely as possible. And autism is a difficult disability, admittedly, to recognise, because it doesn't present itself through any physical symptoms, but it is crucial to have an understanding of it if you're going to then put people into a workplace situation which may prove to be stressful and counterproductive for them.
Final minute.
Now, vulnerable people are not asking for much. The view that appears to be being put forward by UK ministers is that the welfare state is a comfort blanket. It's not a comfort blanket, it's a safety net. And what they are doing, as Michael McMahon alluded to, is widening the holes in that safety net so more people will fall through it. And yet, at the same time, the rich get their taxes cut, while the poor are hit by welfare cuts and welfare reform. The notion that seems to be being put forward, and I could probably sum up the logic as this, is that it appears to be the view that the rich will work harder if we give them more money, and the poor will work harder if we give them less money. That's the logic that is being put forward here. It's ridiculous, it's inhumane, it attacks the most vulnerable in our society. They ought to be ashamed of themselves.
Thank you very much. Kezia Dugdale, to be followed by Kevin Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I welcome the opportunity to contribute to this afternoon's debate. The report from Sheffield Hallam lays out in stark terms the impact of welfare reform. I was particularly struck by a line on page 7 of the report which says, "A focus on adults of working age, that's 16 to 64, is appropriate because welfare reform's impact is almost exclusively on this group. But we really know that the full force of these changes will be felt by families, and in particular the children within those families. I therefore welcome the In the Eye of the Storm report, Britain's Forgotten Children and Families, published in June last year for the NSPCC, the Children's Society and Action for Children. And that report looks in particular at vulnerable families. And by that, Presiding Officer, the report means families affected by one of 7 factors: worklessness, housing, lack of qualifications, mental health, illness and disability, low income or material deprivation. The report says that the impact on families of these tax and benefit changes, combined with cuts to public services on vulnerable families, is the equivalent of £3,000 each. The report goes on to say their negative impact on family income will increase the more vulnerable you are. I want to spend the rest of my time concentrating on the impact of that reduced income, Presiding Officer, whether it's the £480 for the average adult of working age or the £3,000 on the most vulnerable families. There is a growing gap between what people need to survive and what they get in the form of income. The question is how they will fill it, and that brings me on to the issue of payday loans. Payday loans were worth £2.2 billion to the UK economy last year. That's the equivalent of 8 million payday loans of £500. What do we know about the people who take them out? Well, Citizens Advice Scotland tell us that 75% of people are in work. Perhaps they are some of those 372,000 Scots affected by cuts to tax credits, or the 621,000 Scots affected by cuts to child benefit that the Sheffield Hallam report identifies. We also know that they are most commonly likely to spend that money they take out on payday loans to pay bills and to buy food. In order to get a payday loan, you must have a bank account and evidence of income. So in many ways, those out of work are largely protected from the impact of payday loans. But we know that will change come October of this year, when universal credit is introduced, and the 125,000 unbanked Scots will currently have to get a bank account in order to access universal credit. That is a brand new market of people, extremely vulnerable people, who will be exposed to the practices of predatory payday lenders. I'd rather not, Mary, if that's okay. Those cuts to benefits, combined with a move from benefits being paid 2 weeks in advance to 4 weeks behind, will create a perfect storm for these companies to exploit. And can I just say, Presiding Officer, I have a couple of constituent stories I would like to mention just now. One is a woman who lives in the East End of Edinburgh who recently applied for a community care grant to buy an orthopaedic bed for her disabled child, a thing that cost several £100s. She applied for a community care grant, got £100 and was told by the Department of Work and Pensions to take out a payday loan to cover the difference. That is absolutely shocking. Now, we know that those community care grants and crisis loans will now become the Scottish Welfare Fund, and that will be managed by local authorities. But are we really sure that people in local authorities and money advice shops across the country won't be telling their constituents to do the same thing? Also, I've recently visited a few food banks in Edinburgh and spoke to a number of people who are at risk of homelessness. When they get their first home, they get something from the council which allows them to sleep on, something to sit on and something to eat with. They don't get white goods, but what they are told is they can get cheap white goods from companies like Bright House that charge extortionate amounts of interest rates. I've also got other constituents who are exposed to payday loans who have severe learning disabilities. They walk into the money shop or the cheque centre and apply for loans, and the people on the other end of those desks don't understand the vulnerabilities of those people involved, and they too end up in £1,000 worth of debt. So I say to the Scottish Government, when they say that they are doing everything they can to mitigate the impacts of welfare reform, are they really looking at the debt that families are getting themselves into as a consequence of this? Mitigation isn't simply about filling the gap between what people used to have and what they get now. It's the extra risks that they take in order to fund their families, to make sure there's food on the table, to make sure kids can buy the books and the clothes and the things that they need. Are they doing enough to make sure people don't turn to payday lenders, whether illegal or otherwise, to protect themselves from those issues? Because, yes, of course.
Cabinet Secretary.
I pay tribute to Kezia Dugdale for the work she's done in this area, and I don't want to have a disagreement with her. I absolutely agree with her about the scale and the impact of these cuts, often in hidden ways. But I've never said we can mitigate all of the impact of this. That is the problem. So my question to her is, are there specific areas of our current budget that she thinks we should reduce in order to put more money into mitigating welfare reform? I'm happy to have that discussion, but it's incumbent on members to come forward with options, because ultimately, when we don't have the power, this is a robbing Peter to pay Paul scenario.
Kezia Dugdale, less than a minute.
I absolutely understand the point the Minister is making. In ways, I'm not asking her for more money. I'm asking her to think more creatively about how we provide public services to help people that are affected by this. So if it's the case of getting money advice services to work with credit unions together in one place in a high street, that's the type of thing she could do that doesn't necessarily cost a huge amount of money. And I would like to work with her to make that happen. So some of the other things I'm asking her to consider is that families will just turn to their credit cards, turn to payday loan companies, put bills in drawers to hide from the problem, and that will come back to her. That will come years down the line in the form of a debt problem she can't escape from. So let's work together now to see what we can do creatively to address some of these problems.
You must conclude. Thank you very much. Kevin Stewart to be followed by Patrick Harvey.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Margaret Lynch of Citizens Advice Scotland has called these welfare reforms the perfect storm. And today in Glasgow at the Welfare Reform Committee, Robin Tennant of the Poverty Alliance called it a tsunami. Presiding Officer, they use the descriptions of natural disasters to say what is going on at this moment in time. But what we are facing here is not a natural disaster. It is very much a man-made disaster, a disaster of the creating of the Tory and Liberal coalition in Westminster. Mrs Scanlon earlier on talked about mental health and the impact of these reforms on people with mental health. And I know that Mrs Scanlon has done a great deal over the years to try and make lives better for those folks suffering from mental health conditions. But can I say to her that what I am seeing at my surgeries, and I know that many others are the same, those folks who are affected most by these reforms are those people who are affected with mental health conditions. People who have severe depression or are bipolar, who are often put through the work capability assessment and given 0 points, which means that they're fit for work, and then go through the appeals process and end up in a situation where they get the maximum amount of points and are deemed not fit for work. During that period of time, their mental health conditions worsen because of the nonsense of the system that is in place. Presiding Officer, I have to say, after today and after many of the hearings that we have held as a committee, I feel angry and uneasy and impotent about dealing with some of the things that we face. Today we heard from a number of people. Agnes Allen, who has already been mentioned, whose daughter, Sarah Jane, has cerebral palsy and a number of other conditions. A family that believed that they had DLA for life for Sarah Jane. That was their safety net. They're worried, if that is withdrawn, about a loss of independence. And I can well understand why they are so worried about that situation. According to the Sheffield Hallam report, we have 55,000 folk who are going to be affected by those changes in Scotland, who are likely to lose on average £3,000 a year. £3,000 a year. Now, many of these folks actually do work. They use their DLA to transport them to work. That is their independence in that regard. Without that DLA, that might not be possible. What I cannot understand about the situation that we find ourselves in is that Lord Freud, on numerous occasions in response to letters from myself, has refused to designate certain vulnerable groups, to take them out of the process. We all know that there are folk out there that are never going to work. Mr MacDonald gave examples earlier. Why is it that these people have to throw that process again and again and again? It is cruel, it is heartless, it is nonsense, is what I would say. We heard also today from Linda Hutchison, and I should say to the folk in the Linda official report, it's Linda with a Y. She was most insistent about that today. From the Glasgow Stronger Together group, a group for people with learning difficulties. I've also talked to the Aberdeen Stronger Together group, and folk were talking about their independence and what they really needed from life. And I have to say that people are particularly scared about what is happening on that front. They've talked about the effects not only on themselves, but in Aberdeen in particular, they were talking about the effects on others. They were showing compassion to other people, whereby we have a government at Westminster which shows compassion to no one. They, I have to say, in terms of Aberdeen Stronger Together and Glasgow Stronger Together, have more gumption about what is going on than most of the government ministers that we have met on this issue. Government ministers that are too feared to come in front of the committee on a formal basis, who would be far too feared, I think, to meet some of the individuals that we have met to discuss their lives and the changes to their lives because of these reforms. And I would challenge Ian Duncan-Smith and Lord Freud to listen to the evidence that we have gathered up thus far, to have the guts to appear in front of our committee, so that we can relate to them what we have heard on numerous occasions about the effects on people's lives. Sometimes we talk far too much about statistics. I wish that Mr Duncan-Smith and Lord Freud would go face to face with these people and listen to them about the effects on their lives. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. Patrick Harvey, to be followed by Linda Fabiani, both a very tight 6 minutes.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and I'd also like to extend my thanks to the Welfare Reform Committee for commissioning this research and bringing it to the Chamber. In any debate about welfare reform, we have to ask, beginning with fundamental questions about what the welfare state is for, what its purpose is. And very often the language which is used includes phrases like safety net. I'm not so keen on the image of a safety net, because it kind of implies it's only really about the people who need to hit that safety net who need to be part of this debate. In reality, a welfare state is about the relationships between all of us in society. The idea that we all contribute, we all receive benefit, whether in money terms or in social terms. We are living together in a society, and the relationships between us are more than just transactional. The language of this debate is often very divisive, and I don't believe the UK Government would be finding it politically possible to achieve the fundamental attack on the principles of the welfare state that it's currently enacting if it hadn't been for years and years and years of divisive language. The language of as Mr McMahon used the phrase, so-called feckless people out of work. That kind of language we hear used, not in the way that he used it, I have to hasten to add, all too often. The language of strivers and skivers, and the other old favourite, hard-working families. These kind of phrases are intended to undermine the empathy and compassion that people feel for one another. I give way.
Mark MacDonald.
I wonder if Mr Harvey would also agree that the constant over-reporting of those who fraudulently claim benefit, for example, who make up a tiny proportion of the benefit spend, which gives the impression that such behaviour is far more widespread than it is, also contributes to the fact that this sort of rhetoric occurs.
Patrick Harvey.
I agree completely, and the arguments on stigma, for example, we should be placing a far higher social stigma on the people who avoid paying their share of taxation than the much smaller number of people who are involved in what he's describing. Last week, in last Thursday's debate, Deputy Presiding Officer, we heard some of the Conservative benches telling the horror story of the 1970s. Now, whatever the problems with the economy and the state of industrial relations in the 1970s, it's very clear that if we don't look at GDP, but we look at human well-being, 1976 was the high point. 30 years, thereabouts, of the post-war settlement and the operation of a welfare state resulted in a historic high point of human well-being. And now, after 30 years of centre-right economics, a growing gap between the rich and the poor, or the rich and the rest, we've never approached the same level of human well-being. So I agree when Ed Miliband talks to the Labour Party conference, says that a new settlement is needed. I may believe personally we're more likely to achieve that new settlement if we do take the powers on welfare and taxation and everything else to Scotland. But what we should agree on across that divide, across that debate, is that the principle of reform must be about restoring the ethos of the welfare state, actually winning again from first principles the argument for a welfare state, an argument which sadly has been lost in recent years, not dismantling it but restoring that ethos. So simplicity, less bureaucracy, less stigma, these are all good things to aim for. But to take forward reform at the same time as vast cuts to the scale of the welfare state is a wrecking agenda. On alternatives, my party will continue to argue that an idea which sadly was dismissed in the Beveridge report, which had a degree of support at the time, a citizen's income, a universal benefit which removes at a stroke the poverty trap and the benefit trap that so many people are in, is a dramatically simpler system to administer and also redistributive, would leave many people on roughly the same income, in the middle, roughly the same income, but people higher up the income scale would be paying more. It would close the gap between rich and poor. But there's also a question of mitigation in the shorter term. And while Annabel Ewing said that that question is all about power, I think that's only half right. It's partly about power, absolutely. It's also about the will. We also need the will to exercise those powers. And so I believe that you will find complete agreement between Annabel Ewing and myself about bringing those powers to Scotland. But we also have to have the will to exercise them right now. So I was disappointed that the problems in relation to the bedroom tax, as I think in this debate most clearly articulated by Ian Gray, there isn't a willingness to take the mitigation measures, for example, with the use of a higher band of council tax for the most expensive properties. That's been described by the Scottish Government as robbing Peter to pay Paul. Well, that's what tax and benefits is all about. That's about deciding who's going to contribute and who's going to receive. Alex Johnson asked us who was going to pay more. Well, I'll put up my hand. I should be paying more. Every member in this chamber is in the top 2% of incomes. We should be paying more tax. We should be paying, actually, frankly, Deputy Presiding Officer, a lot more tax than we do at the moment. And so tax honesty is also crucial in the future of this debate, a willingness to raise the taxes to pay for the benefits and the services that we say we want to protect.
Thank you very much. Linda Fabiani.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I wasn't a member of the Welfare Reform Committee when this report by Professor Fothergill and Christina Beattie was actually commissioned, but I have to say I'm so glad that the committee did commission it, because it's such an interesting report, well presented last week by Professor Fothergill and encapsulated today by Michael McMahon, our convener. Really interesting stuff in there about the £1.6 billion a year out of the Scottish economy, or £480 per year for every adult of working age. And the report is very stark. It finds a clear and unambiguous relationship between the level of deprivation in a community and the financial hit from welfare cuts. And it questions whether employment will in fact be any higher as a result of these reforms, although that is the intention of the UK Government, and concludes that the cuts will add a further twist to the downward spiral. So what it's actually doing is further entrenching the UK's already deep income inequalities. It's an excellent report, and one which says what the title says. It shows the impact of welfare reform in Scotland, what it's likely to be. And in financial terms, of course, that's fine, but behind the economic and financial impact, there are people. There are single people, couples, single parents, two-parent families. We met some of these folk in Glasgow this morning. And can I say to Willie Rennie, none of these people were in fact spineless complainers. No. And I don't believe anyone who's complaining about these welfare reforms are spineless complainers. George Osborne, of course, no thank you, we heard enough earlier. George Osborne as well was in Glasgow this morning, but he didn't come near our informal committee session, I have to say. And I would say that rather than scaremongering about independence, he would have been better served coming along to the City Hall and trying to justify why his government is intent on shafting the most vulnerable people in Scotland. We heard from Agnes this morning, she's been mentioned already, and a phrase she used has been used too by Michael McMahon and Patrick Harvey today. Agnes said how upset she was when she heard the language being used, skivers and strivers. And as she said, David Cameron, Ian Duncan Smith, Lord Freud, they have absolutely no idea what striving is. Striving is what many people do, day in and day out. Folk whose children were born or acquired physical and mental disabilities, folk who became ill, folk who have hit hard times and don't have the cushion of wealth to land on, folk who are poorly paid, people who have worked hard, worked the best they can. The majority of benefit claimants are decent, ordinary people. We've heard from them at formal and informal committee sessions. I'm sure that MSPs in this chamber today have heard from them in their offices, in their surgeries, by phone, by email, by letter. And I'm sure that some of us have family and friends who are directly affected by these welfare reforms. I know I do. I have a pal with learning difficulties who is suffering regular panic attacks and depression about work assessments. And, you know, it's like others have said, he will never be in a position to hold down a full-time job. So why is he being forced to go through all this stress and strain regularly? I have a very close friend, practically housebound due to serious illness, who, by the way, worked full-time for many, many years before she hit hard times. And her greatest pleasure is having her son and his family come to stay over for a few days from their home some 200 miles away. First grandchild. She loves it. It's a two-bedroom flat which has been her home for over 20 years. And, of course, she's now been served with a notice of bedroom tax due. She can't afford it. So is she going to lose her home? Much more could be said. Much has been said in here this afternoon. I'm sure that if the Parliament had power over the welfare system, much of this rhetoric would be unnecessary, because it's clear to me that there is no stomach for any of this, except amongst the Conservatives and the Lib Dems. Cooperation? No. We had the chance, during the deliberations of the last Scotland Act, to send a cross-party demand to Westminster about devolving welfare to this Parliament. As SCVO said then, and as they reiterate now, devolving welfare is a policy which would enable a Scottish Government to more effectively protect and help the most vulnerable in our society. No, thank you. Our Government is doing what they can. More could be done if welfare was devolved. Even now, we could work together and we could send that message from one side of the chamber, at least. And Patrick and Alison and the others at the back. I'll end with some of the words that we heard this morning. I posed the question to witnesses of what they would like to say to those in this Parliament who represent Scotland but who weren't represented this morning at that meeting. So to the Lib Dems and the Conservatives, the message was quite clear. It was, help us to get it stopped. Another witness posed the question to all of us. She said, surely if we vote for independence, people would be exempted. I believe so. I believe an integrated tax and benefit system in an independent Scotland would be fairer and sustainable. So, in the terms of this debate, I note the Sheffield-Hallam report, but I also note that independence is the only way forward, as far as I am concerned, for Scotland.
Thank you very much. We now turn to closing speeches, and members who have participated in this debate should be in the chamber for closing speeches. I call on Mary Scanlon with a very tight 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I would also like to thank the committee for their second report on this issue, which I read with interest. And I also look forward to the recommendations which Michael McMahon said were coming. I think that would also be helpful, particularly to those of us who are not members of the committee and obviously haven't heard all the evidence. The main headline in the report is that the present welfare reforms will eventually take £1.6 billion a year out of the Scottish economy. And as Alec Johnson said, I didn't find any analysis on how much would be brought back into the economy by people being supported into work. The outcry from the Labour and the SNP about capping benefits at £26,000 is certainly not shared by people across Scotland, given the YouGov poll, where 72% of support for capping benefits, which was 3% higher than in England. And I would also remind members that this benefit cap of £26,000 in income is equivalent to a gross salary of £35,000. And currently, currently the average salary across Scotland the average across Scotland is under £23,000, and in the Highlands, the average salary is just over £20,000. So if the Labour and the SNP do not support the cap on benefits, they need to tell people across Scotland. And as my colleague Alec Johnson said, and I did hear question time last week, and Caroline Flint, Labour Member of Parliament, clearly said that she supported the cap and would want it increased for areas, particularly London. So I think Labour have to be honest here. Is there a Scottish policy or a policy for this Parliament, and is there a separate policy at the Westminster Parliament? And, Presiding Officer, we've heard bitter complaints from Labour and the SNP about the UK government's coalition government's welfare reform. And I would say on that issue that both Alec Johnson and myself welcomed Patrick Harvey's contribution, because at least Patrick Harvey was honest about what he would put in place. But what would, if I can finish this point, but what would they say if they were ever in a position to implement? Well, we don't know. But what we can assume by everything that's been said is that we would have higher taxes in Scotland, we would have higher benefits, we would have a lifetime part-on benefits, and I'll come back to mental health, with no review of people's abilities or needs or support to get them in work. We would have housing benefit at up to £2,000 a week, and we would have child benefit for millionaires. Well, you've never said where. You've never
Please
said
speak
anything.
through the chair.
It's all very well to criticise, but you can't be against everything and for nothing. And since 2010, I would remind members that 224,000 people in Scotland have been taken out of paying any tax at all, and this will rise again next year as the personal allowance increases to £10,000. So was this significant increase in disposable income taken into account when Sheffield Hallam and the committee report reached the £1.6 billion figure? Because as an economist, it is important to include this additional disposable income, given that the marginal propensity to consume is higher for lower incomes, and this would have a significant increase in the multiplier effect. I have less than 2 minutes left. Sorry. Another point stated in page 5 of the report, which I was trying to get in interventions, and it refers to the Labour Party, and I read from the report. Some of the incapacity benefit reforms, however, are Labour measures that predate the 2010 general election, but are only now taking full effect. So, which ones are you for? The ones that you already implemented? I refer to the Labour Party. And which ones are you against? I think you have to be absolutely honest on that point. And the report does state that the figures do not assume that the loss of income from benefits will wholly or even partly be replaced by additional income. But what we do know about welfare reform is that already many changes have been made, and I welcome them. I'm sorry that others haven't. Professor Harrington has already made changes in respect to fluctuating conditions, ME, MS, Parkinson's and mental health. And like other members, I think Kevin Stewart was one, who has been in touch with the Minister, I've also written to the United Kingdom Minister on motor neuron disease, because I feel that there are instances where that should be included, where sometimes conditions can deteriorate rapidly. And my final point is on mental health services. 45% of people on benefit. We can look at the cuts, but what we need to look at is early diagnosis, early intervention, less stigma, and a commitment to helping people stay in their jobs.
Thank you very much. Drew Smith, a very tight 6 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Welfare Reform Committee was established following the agreement of this Parliament to reject a motion providing legislative consent to the UK Government on aspects of welfare reform. And this debate has again underlined that we were right to push for that approach. On this side, we have said that we do recognise that the welfare system was in need of further change, and we did support, for example, the principle of universal credit to ensure that a fairer and simpler welfare state, which is then secured through enhanced public support for the assistance which it provides to us all when in times or circumstances of need. But it does, and we did make changes in government, but it does remain our view that, in addition to reform of the welfare system itself, the primary need is to ensure for those of us who are able to work that there is decent work for us to do. The exposition we have heard on the impact of the changes which the Tory-led government are making reinforces our view that the UK Government have failed to get that balance correct, and that they have in fact made a number of changes which are unfair and unlikely to work in and of themselves, such as the bedroom tax, which Mark MacDonald quite rightly highlighted, in which, when we take collectively, represent real and significant reductions in the individual incomes of many, including many of the working poor. And they are also a serious threat to local economies in many of the areas of the country which are already most deprived. In short, the report justifies the stance that we have taken alongside the Scottish Government to reject the approach of the UK Government and to, where possible, seek to minimise the impact that negative changes will have on the people that we represent, and to use the substantial powers of this place to assist those most in need. The latter part of that statement...
Mr Rennie, sorry, Mr Smith, I wonder if you'd mind turning to face the chair and perhaps retaking your seat. Thank you very much, instead of conducting conversations.
Thank you, President Officer.
Smith.
The latter part of that statement, the issue around powers, is where there is a degree of disagreement between Labour and the SNP. We've heard some of that today, but it has also been good to hear the argument being put by the Tories and the Lib Dems, and it's been a bit of a change for those of us who are used of this debate to hear such boisterous support, other than, of course, from Mr Johnson, who is always with us. But it's good to see the Lib Dems coming and actually taking part in defending their policy, which hasn't been the case in every one of these debates that we've had. As a Glasgow MSP, I do want to also highlight thank the convener and many others for highlighting the circumstances of Glasgow, and where, according to this report, there is likely to be a loss of £270 million in spending power as a result of these changes. Bob Doris was absolutely right that, in absolute terms, it is the figure which is second, I think, only to Birmingham. And the £1.6 billion Scottish figure, which the committee has obtained, is larger than some of the figures we've previously been working from, such as Local Government Forum Against Poverty report. It's lower than CAB believed that it might be, and it's substantially lower than the figure that the Scottish Government have publicised. So having independent figures in the public domain is useful, and I think this report has been a significant staging post on the journey to understanding what the likely consequences will be, and therefore what our priorities should be, both in terms of mitigation of Tory policy, but also better prioritising spending which is made by this current Scottish Government. And Jackie Bailey was right to highlight the information in the Herald today on that subject. We've heard that Scotland is mid-table in terms of impact. We are not as badly affected as the north of England, as Wales or London, but worse off than southern England, excluding London. And we sit between the West Midlands, which is above us in terms of impact, and East Midlands, where there is less impact than here, right in the middle of the table, really. Alec Johnson, though, was on one point right when he said that the impact here in Scotland is, of course, differentiated too. The North East, excluding Dundee, is much less affected in terms of numbers of people than places like Glasgow, Renfrewshire, Inverclyde, Lanarkshire, West Dunbartonshire. In other words, the impact is felt hardest in those areas which are already the most deprived and where services are already most stretched. And, of course, when it comes to local authorities putting money in to support council tax benefit, where there is the least money available to do that, as well as by those people for whom life is already more difficult than that of their neighbours. And I actually thought that the evidence that the committee heard from Mike Holmes of Enable highlighted this point when he talked about a perfect storm. It was highlighted in the SCVO briefing for this debate, but it hasn't been picked up on. But he spoke about changes to services, tightening eligibility, fewer college places, a harder jobs market, and, crucially, the already low and shockingly low levels of employment that already and previously existed amongst disabled people. But in terms of the changes to the benefits system across Scotland, it is the changes to uprating, to incapacity benefit and to working tax credits which add up to the biggest overall losses, particularly on tax credits. Thank you, Presiding Officer. It is particularly disappointing to us, given the role that tax credits played in part of our success in substantially reducing levels of poverty when we were in government. Just finally, Presiding Officer, I want to touch on the issue of bedroom tax. Bernardo's called on us in their briefing before the debate to move our debate beyond the issue of bedroom tax, but it's been highlighted by a number of members this afternoon, and I did think it was most clearly set out by Ian Gray, but a number of other members mentioned it. There is a disagreement between Labour and the SNP on how we should respond to the bedroom tax. And what I would say, I suppose, about it is that, to me, the bedroom tax is important, firstly because, yes, there are significant numbers of people affected, but secondly because it is also an example of a change which is both unfair and can be readily understood to be unfair, and it therefore presents an opportunity to help us convince those large numbers of people who are supportive of punitive welfare changes that the Tory approach is not the right one.
You must close, Mr Smith.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. Calling Margaret Burgess, 7 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I would also like to thank the Welfare Reform Committee for commissioning the report from Sheffield Hallam University and for bringing this debate to the Chamber today, because every opportunity this Parliament has to make its voice heard in such an important issue is valuable. And we've heard today lots of passionate views and stories, and I think the heart-wrenching stories that Michael McMahon mentioned at the opening of the debate really sums it up for me, because these are not isolated stories. These are cases that are throughout Scotland, in every constituency in Scotland, and I know in other parts of the UK as well, but we are here today to talk about the impact in Scotland. And I think, for anyone who thinks that those are just a few cases, really need to think again. Also, I think Linda Fabiani made the point that we all know people affected by the benefit changes and welfare reforms. It's not a case of they're all people out there skiving from work. It's not right to suggest that the people we know are just unfortunate or in an unfortunate situation, but everybody else is skiving. We all know people that are not in that position because of their making, and therefore they deserve to be protected by the state. But I want to say a bit more on the bedroom tax, because it's been talked about a lot today, and I don't think there's a great deal of disagreement between ourselves and the Labour Party on the bedroom tax. But what I would say to them is that we know that within Scotland there will be £65 million it costs the bedroom tax alone in Scotland, with a one-off estimated negative impact of £87 million. And what I'm saying to the Labour Party today is, where do they think that £55 million, even if we topped up the £10 million, I will in a moment, I'll give way, even if they suggest that the £10 million of discretionary housing payment were to come off that, there has been no suggestion of where that has to come from. I'll give way now to Ian Gray.
The Minister not acknowledged that this is what is wrong with this debate. We agree that we have to rob Peter to pay Paul, and that's less than ideal. But it is the Scottish Government who have the budget. Let us sit down, make suggestions where this might be found. We have to agree that those painful cuts elsewhere are something that we will support for the greater good. That's the way to move this forward, not to demand suggestions from those of us who don't have access to the books.
Minister.
Well, I would say to Ian Gray that we've heard from, this debate in the main has been quite consensual, but I think there's been issues raised here that we have to take on. And I think Ian Gray is saying, yes, let us sit and let you see the books. We've heard so much from the Labour Party in this Parliament about what we need to do to sort out problems. It's for college, it's for everything, but there's been not one concrete suggestion where it's coming from. We've also heard the difference between what's happening here in Scotland and what's happening with the Labour Party in England.
Order, please.
So I have to say, we're wanting to rewrite on childcare, we're wanting to rewrite on benefits,
please.
And I do think that we have to look at that, and what we're saying is, when we can help lessen the impact of these UK Government welfare reforms, we will. We'll listen to ways from others of doing it, I'll give way.
Patrick Harvey.
I'm grateful to the Minister. This issue is not about the Labour Party and the SNP. It's about what we can all do collectively. The suggestion about using an additional higher band of the council tax to meet this shortfall has been dismissed by the Scottish Government as robbing Peter to pay Paul. If Peter can afford to pay more and Paul can't afford to live, isn't the moral basis for redistribution inescapable?
Minister.
What I would say to Patrick Harvey is that you're being honest in making a point. We have given a commitment to the people of Scotland in terms of council tax. It's helping many households throughout Scotland. In England, they have seen an increase of 10% in their council tax over the last since 2007, where in Scotland theirs has been frozen, and we will continue with that. No, I'm not giving way at the moment because I've hardly moved on to the speech. What I am saying is now we're hearing the reality of it. We're hearing the reality of what is happening, and you're quite right, Patrick Harvey is quite right, Presiding Officer. It's not simply between Labour and the SNP, but that is what it's boiling down to at this moment, because Labour are not being honest in this. We're hearing different stories at different times from within this Parliament, from the local authorities, and from what they're saying within the UK, Labour are saying within the UK. But I want to go back now to discretionary housing payments, because the UK Government are not telling the truth in this. They are telling us that discretionary housing payments are sufficient to deal with the hard cases, and that's ridiculous, because in Scotland we know that there is as many people being affected by the bedroom tax in Scotland as in London, and yet we are getting a lot less money than London are getting. We are getting £10 million, while London are getting £56 million. And I think in anybody's books that's not fair, and nor is it our problem, and we are paying the price to solve a problem in the rest of the UK. And as well as the reforms that we've talked about in bedroom tax having an impact, there's more to come. We still have significant concerns about universal credit. Some of the problems we foresee will compound the harms already being caused by other reforms, but there are still more we haven't faced yet. And local authority-led pilots and demonstration projects in Scotland, including additional pilots funded by the Scottish Government, are looking at specific areas of concern to try and bottom out the issues.
Final minute.
And that's why I'm pleased to confirm to Parliament that, as announced this morning by the Deputy First Minister, the Scottish Government will award £170,000 to Glasgow City Council for an additional 2-year pilot to help people across the city use public access computers in the library network when making benefit claims, building skills and capacity in advance of universal credit. And we all know how Glasgow is going to suffer from the welfare reforms, and we also know that Glasgow has a higher percentage than average of people having access to online facilities. So there's lots more I would have wanted to say about the damaging cuts that will come alongside PIP. And we've introduced legislation. I'm pleased that the Welfare Reform Committee have welcomed what we've done in terms of passported benefits and in terms of what we're trying to do with the Scottish Welfare Fund, which came into force this month. But again, as I've said before in this chamber, I honestly believe to get a welfare system you don't start by just saying we want to save money. You look at what's required and you build it up from there, protecting the most vulnerable. And I believe we can only do that properly with an independent Scotland in charge of our own economy.
I now call Jamie Hepburn to wind up the debate. 8 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And can I begin by thanking those members who have taken part in today's debate. And at the outset, let me say to Willie Rennie, he shouldn't be ashamed. He should always be happy to read my press statements. But because I'm speaking on behalf of the committee today, I might be less strident in my defence of the aforementioned press statement than I usually am. I think, Presiding Officer, the debate today was never likely to lead to unanimity across the chamber, but nonetheless it's been no less productive for that. A number of important issues have been identified, and I think that will help the committee as we take our work forward. I can also thank the various bodies, various agencies out there who provided briefing material for today's debate. I think that demonstrates the great level of interest in the report before us, and also the issue of welfare reform more generally. I can also echo the conveners' thanks of Steve Fothergill and Christina Beattie of the Centre for Regional Economic and Social Research at Sheffield Hallam University, and their work in pulling together the excellent report, The Impact of Welfare Reform on Scotland, which was of course commissioned by the committee. I will try and pick up on as many of the points raised by as many members through the debate as I can. I apologise if I'm unable to pick up on everything, but I want to begin by reiterating some of the headline figures from the report. They've been mentioned already, Presiding Officer, but I think they are worth re-emphasising. The first point that was made by Jackie Bailey and others is that although the financial losses are very large, the scale of the loss in Scotland measured per adult of working age is broadly on a par with the GB average. Indeed, Table 3 within the report does set out they are broadly in line. There is a slightly higher impact in Scotland than the GB average, but it is marginal. But the report does make the important point, and I think we should put it on record, that the gap between Scotland and the GB average would have been somewhat wider, around £20 per adult of working age, if the cut in council tax benefit to local authorities had been passed on, because that would have obviously been passed on to the claimants themselves. The absolute headline figure that attracted most attention when the report was released and has been cited today, the convener mentioned in his opening remarks, was that when the present welfare reforms have come into full effect, they will take more than £1.6 billion a year out of the Scottish economy. That's equivalent to around £480 a year for every adult of working age. And of course this, briefly...
Dennis Robertson.
I'm very grateful to the member for giving me on that point. Is the real cost not the emotional and psychological and fear of the reforms that are yet to come, not just the finance?
Jamie Hepburn.
Well, of course, beyond these headline figures, it does affect real people. That's been remarked upon over the course of today's debate, and if time allows, I may say a little bit about that myself. The headline figure is £1.6 billion, but it does impact on some areas more than others. Bob Doris and Drew Smith were able to correctly identify that Glasgow, in absolute terms, is the most heavily affected area, losing some £269 million per annum, which is second only to Birmingham of the local authorities across Great Britain, followed by Edinburgh, £135 million, and then my own local authority area, North Lanarkshire, £123 million, and the loss per working age adult is again highest in Glasgow, some £650, followed by Inverclyde on £630 per annum. Now that indicates, of course, and this probably isn't that surprising, Presiding Officer, that the most deprived areas are those areas being hit hardest by these reforms, and that's demonstrated clearly in Figure 1 in the report that we debate today. Now, I know there has been some contention about the £1.6 billion per annum figures. These were questioned by both Mary Scanlon and Alec Johnson, the idea that it's money being removed from the economy. Now, this was a line of inquiry pursued with Professor Fothergill when he came to present his figures. And let me say to Mary Scanlon, I understand the point she was attempting to make, but let me be clear. The report that was commissioned by the Welfare Reform Committee was not intended to be an assessment of the UK Government's overall economic policy, rather an in-depth look at the level of the impact of welfare reform here in Scotland. Indeed.
Patrick Harvey.
Does the member agree that it's likely, if the wider question had been addressed by this research, it would have found very clearly that the money coming out of the economy through welfare cuts and reforms will hit hardest on the poorest, whereas money coming back in through changes to the tax threshold will be spread much more widely, so it increases social inequality?
That may be a fair point to make, but also, and this was a point I wanted to go on to make, because I pursued that line of inquiry with Professor Fothergill at the committee, and essentially the point is that you could only argue £1.6 billion wasn't being withdrawn from the economy if an equivalent £1.6 billion was being handed back to the people of Scotland, and there is no evidence to suggest that that is the case. And of course, as well, we also have to look at the impact on local economies. George Adams was talking about the impact on local economies, and Professor Fothergill was able to set out that he was aware that there is plenty of research demonstrating that welfare benefit claimants actually spend most of, if not all, their income, whereas more affluent groups can afford to put some away for a rainy day. You would therefore expect most of that loss of income to feed through fairly directly to a loss of spending. So there could also be an impact on local economies and economic recovery as well. Presiding Officer, I want to turn to the specific areas of loss. The biggest financial losses within the £1.6 billion figure arise from reforms to incapacity benefits, some £500 million a year, and changes to tax credits, £300 million a year. Together, combined, these make up for half the reduction. The reduction, the loss in terms of incapacity benefits, affects 144,000 households, £500 million per annum.
The member's coming into his final minute. We're very tight for time.
Do I have time?
There is no time, but
okay.
If you can...
Well, I apologise to Mr Rennie, otherwise I would have been happy to. The estimated loss per annum is £500 million. The average loss per affected household is £3,480. And when you look at the changes to DLA coming to be PIP, the average loss per affected household per annum is £3,000. This is identified in the report. And some households will be affected by, as the convener mentioned, by the loss of both. So some households may lose over £6,000. I would pose the question, what household could sustain that level of loss? There was much discussion about the changes to housing benefit, the bedroom tax. I don't have time to go into that in great detail, but let me say we took some very important evidence from a variety of individuals today in Glasgow, quite emotive evidence, and I think that demonstrates the point made by Dennis Robertson in intervention to me. Behind all the figures that are detailed in the report that we are debating today, Presiding Officer, there are individual stories. Individuals are being impacted, and I want to give a reassurance to those individuals from the committee that they will be the people that we focus on as we take our work further forward.
Thank you very much. We now move on to the next item of business, which is the debate on motion number S4M 06243 in the name of Fiona MacLeod on behalf of the National Trust for Scotland Governance etc. Bill Committee on the preliminary stage of the National Trust for Scotland Governance etc. Bill. Can members who wish to speak in the debate press the request to speak buttons now, and I call on Fiona MacLeod to speak to and move the motion with a very tight 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I begin as convener of the National Trust Governance etc. Bill Committee by giving my thanks to, amongst others, my fellow committee members, to those who took the time to give us evidence, both written and as witnesses, and especially to the clerks and Spice for all the support that they gave us. I want to, as convener, use my tight 6 minutes to talk about the background to why we have this private bill before us in Parliament today, and to talk about the broad principles, and the other members of the committee will talk about specific aspects of the bill. But first, can I say that in our preliminary stage report, we clearly stated that the committee was satisfied that a private bill is necessary, as we must do under Standing Order Rules 9A.1.1 and 9A.8.3. But if we turn to why do we have this private bill before us in Parliament just now, I'm sure many of us will remember the headlines back in 2008 when the National Trust for Scotland was really at a crisis point and standing at a crossroads. We were looking at closures of some of our best-loved properties. We were even looking at sales of some of them. And at the same time, Oscar actually had a criticism of the governance of the National Trust for Scotland in its report, Who's in Charge? So all of this led to a major strategic review in 2009 to 2010 of the National Trust for Scotland, and that review was led by our own former presiding officer, Sir George Reid. In the Reid report entitled Fit for Purpose, Sir George pulled absolutely no punches about the state that the National Trust for Scotland had found itself in. He talked about the Byzantine governance structure, a structure that led to a situation where there was no strategic direction for the National Trust in Scotland, and sometimes even worse in terms of an inability to tackle problematic issues as they arose. The report by Sir George Reid, taken over a 2-year period, followed, as in Sir George's own words, a massive programme of engagement, participation and consultation. And I was very impressed to see that so well conducted and so inclusive was that consultation that at the 2010 AGM of the National Trust for Scotland, the reforms in the report were endorsed by a vote of 424 to 2 members of the National Trust for Scotland. So when we went into looking at this bill, we were assured that it had the support of the people who really knew what it was about. In the interim period since the 2010 AGM, many of the reforms have in fact been implemented, and we've seen a good many benefits to the National Trust for Scotland since then. It now has a single governance structure with a board of trustees of 15 members. Previously, the two boards and the two methods of governance had, I think, a total of 87 members between them. I think members can understand why it was so unwieldy and perhaps unable to make strategic decisions. The reforms that have been implemented since then have received Oscar's approval, and perhaps most significantly to the members of the public who, like me, are passionate supporters of the National Trust for Scotland, they now have reserves of 21 million, so hopefully we won't be looking at that dreadful situation in 2008 when it was, do we have to sell things off to manage? So in this bill today, at the preliminary stage before us today, we heard in evidence from Sir George Reid that this bill itself is, and I quote, the final milestone in the process of reform and revitalisation of the National Trust for Scotland. And Sir Kenneth Calman, the current chair of the Board of Trustees, talked about it being vital as the last part of the jigsaw. Now, before I finish, I do have to mention that in the 1935 order that set up the National Trust for Scotland, its actual name in legislation is the National Trust for Scotland for Places of Historic Interest or Natural Beauty. Now, I have talked about the National Trust for Scotland throughout, and I'm sure most of us who visit any of the properties call it exactly that, the National Trust for Scotland. But this bill ensures that that short form that we all use will now be legally watertight, and we don't have to always talk about the great big long title as in the 1935 order. So, Presiding Officer, I and my committee are pleased to have played our small part for this much valued national institution. And in closing, can I move that the Parliament agrees to the general principles of the National Trust for Scotland Governance, etc. Bill, and that the bill should proceed as a private bill? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call on Fiona Hislop, Cabinet Secretary. A tight 6 minutes, please.
Presiding Officer, I was keen to speak today, not just to support this bill, but because I wish to emphasise the vital role which the National Trust for Scotland plays in our national life, and to place on record the regard and affection in which it is held by so many of us. In order to give a sense of this, I think it would be useful to consider the following facts. The Trust is the third largest landowner in Scotland, with 76,000 hectares. It is the owner of 270 listed buildings. It is responsible for 46 Munros, 7 national nature reserves, 45 sites of special scientific interest, and the United Kingdom's only mixed World Heritage Site at St Kilda. And this government, like its predecessors, has worked closely with the Trust, supporting the splendid Robert Burns Birthplace Museum, for example, and the exciting new visitor facilities currently under development at Bannockburn. But we recognise that the main support for the Trust in its work of caring for so many of our national treasures comes from over 300,000 devoted members, from its many volunteers, its imaginative fundraising activities and the income from its trading activities. When the Trust encountered difficulties a few years ago, I sensed a collective intake of breath right across Scotland. If the National Trust's future could be in jeopardy, what other treasured institutions might be at risk? And the painstaking review of the Trust's activities, structures and governance, which were followed and undertaken by George Reid, charted a course to safety, along which the Trust has travelled, facing some hard decisions along the way. The Reid Review identified the complexity of the Trust governance arrangements as a serious obstacle to progress, stating that they, I quote, they prevent the Trust tackling issues and setting a strategic direction. The review recommended a number of changes, almost all of which have been given effect by administrative action. The Trust's 5-year strategy was launched in September 2011 with the aim of guiding it away from this period of difficulty. In it, 5 strategic priorities were identified: the portfolio and its conservation, the promotion of Scotland's heritage, financial sustainability, visitor enjoyment and investment in our people. I am pleased to see the hard work that has been undertaken since its introduction to deliver on these priorities, and I am thoroughly encouraged at the direction that the Trust is now moving in. The bill before us deals with the last few changes as recommended by the Reid Review, where legislative action is needed to complete the modernisation of the Trust's governance. And has already been mentioned by the Chair of the Committee, these changes are relatively minor in their nature, yet can be seen as another fundamental step in part of that continuing journey that the Trust is on. As members will be aware, the Government plans shortly to consult on proposals to establish and further develop a high-level strategy for Scotland's historic environment, and also on provisions to create a new single lead body to carry out the roles appropriate to national government in this area. In the preparatory work for that consultation, undertaken with a wide range of stakeholders, the role of the National Trust for Scotland as an independent partner in our diverse heritage landscape was widely recognised. The Trust provides an informed and inspiring voice on heritage issues. The range and depth of its experience offer strengths which complement and expand upon what can be achieved by government and its agencies. In the proposals, we detail plans to bring together Historic Scotland and the Royal Commission on the Ancient and Historical Monuments of Scotland into a single body, and we will therefore be taking great care to ensure the continuation of the Trust's important and distinctive role as a key player in a Team Scotland approach, an idea the Trust has been instrumental in developing. In many respects, this bill before us offers an opportunity to emphasise the value of partnership working between government and the third sector, between Parliament and the third sector. The Trust is a conservation charity which defines its mission as working for the good of Scotland, and it is a significant partner in delivering a considerable number of Scottish Government policy objectives. A new emphasis has been placed on developing and maintaining partnerships and creating new synergies across Scotland, a fact which can only be beneficial to all parties concerned. And the Trust will contribute significantly to the much-anticipated Year of Homecoming in 2014, and as I have mentioned already, has been a central part of 2 of Scotland's major cultural projects over recent years, the Robert Burns Birthplace Museum and the Bannockburn Visitor Centre. So a strong and well-managed National Trust for Scotland is a key part of delivering the Scottish Government's vision in terms of the conservation of Scotland's rich cultural and natural heritage, environmental awareness and education. It is also a significant contributor of economic benefit to the nation and to local communities, particularly in remote and rural areas. So therefore, Presiding Officer, I stand before this Chamber this afternoon fully in support of the bill before us.
Thank you very much. And we now turn to the open debate. We're slightly oversubscribed, so speeches of around 3 minutes. And I call James Dornan, to be followed by Patricia Ferguson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Scotland has some of the finest cultural and natural heritage to be found anywhere in the world, and protection for future generations is something we should all strive to. The work of the National Trust for Scotland is integral in achieving that aim. The influence of the National Trust for Scotland is clear in constituencies across the country. I am delighted that in my own constituency, the National Trust for Scotland helps oversee 2 buildings of historical importance. The first, Homewood House, described as Alexander Greek Thomson's finest domestic design, and the second being Pollock House, based in Pollock Country Park, just a stone's throw away from the famous Borough collection. Pollock House is regarded as one of Scotland's grandest Edwardian country homes and dates back to the 13th century. And of course, Pollock House was the ancestral home of the Maxwell family. Indeed, Sir John Stirling Maxwell, 10th Baronet of Pollock, was one of the founding members of the National Trust for Scotland, served as one of the Trust's first vice-presidents, and was the president of the National Trust from 1945 until his death in 1956. He believed strongly in the important role that green spaces played in the city and was determined to protect the Pollock estate and to ensure the people of Glasgow had access to it. And this ethos is maintained through the work of the National Trust for Scotland. And that is why it is vitally important that it is governed appropriately and is malleable to the changing needs and demands placed on it to continue to protect our culture and natural heritage in the 21st century. I would like to focus on the detail of one of the provisions of the bill, which is concerned with the role of the President and Vice-Presidents of the Trust. The 1935 order, mentioned by my colleague, which put the Trust on a statutory footing, states the Board of Trustees of the Trust must include the President and any Vice-Presidents of the Trust. Those post holders therefore have liability as charity trustees. The Reid Review recommended that the President and any Vice-Presidents should have an impartial role and take no part in decisions of the Board of Trustees. Accordingly, since the review, the President has adopted an impartial ambassadorial role and no longer attends board meetings. Similarly, Vice-Presidents, since the review, have been elected in an honorary capacity only, and this ensures that their role is distinct from day-to-day management and decision-making by the Board. Sir George Reid spoke of the need for a neutral and impartial guardian of the sacred flame and stressed that legislative change is needed to give effect to the process. Sir Kenneth Calman commented on the fact that the bill will remove the responsibility of the Presidents and Vice-Presidents to attend board meetings, which have the benefit of releasing postholders' time, as well as removing conflicts of interest. In its written evidence to the committee, Oscar also welcomed the proposal, which it considered would clarify who has responsibility as charity trustees. We understand that, should the bill succeed, the roles of honorary Vice-Presidents will cease to exist, and Vice-Presidents will be nominated under the new arrangements, free of the requirement to be involved with the Board and free from any liability as a charity trustee. So, while the current workaround satisfies the immediate concerns expressed in Sir George Reid's review, this is not a satisfactory footing for the future. We are therefore supportive of this provision of the bill, which will secure more appropriate modern arrangements for the future. Thank you.
Many thanks. Patricia Ferguson, to be followed by Alec Ferguson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Those of us who value the work that is done by the National Trust for Scotland were saddened by the events of 2008, which saw the National Trust finances dwindle and the organisation having to sell off some of its properties. What was even more disturbing in some ways was the way in which the organisation found itself in the media spotlight for all the wrong reasons. Whether it be a battlefield, a castle or a camping pod at Brodick, the National Trust for Scotland is one of those organisations we entrust with Scotland's heritage, and as such it makes an important contribution to the cultural and the environmental life of the country, a job, I have to say, that it continued to do in spite of the problems it faced. But the contribution of the review undertaken by our friend and colleague Sir George Reid has been an important one, and while his recommendations could largely be taken forward without legislation, it is right that an organisation of such significance as the National Trust is underpinned by legislation, and so I applaud the National Trust for Scotland for bringing forward the bill before us today, and the Bill Committee for its diligence in providing scrutiny of its provisions. As we know, the Trust governance structures have been described as Byzantine and criticised for resulting in, quote, duplication and delay, uncertainty and friction. And when you reflect upon the fact that the organisation had a system of dual governance with a combined total board membership of 87, it is perhaps surprising that it lasted as long as it has. Now, I fully support the provisions of the bill which underpin this more streamlined structure that the committee is looking at. And to look at some of the specific changes proposed, I think it's right that the role of representative members is abolished. The rationale for that system, which existed in the 1930s, no longer applies. When the organisation was founded, it would have wanted to harness the skills and expertise of other organisations to ensure that it could build its capacity. The Reid Review's findings that there are better ways of securing and coordinating that advice seem to me to be sound. James Dornan eloquently outlined the new provisions that will apply in terms of the President and Vice-President, freeing them from their status as charity trustees and ensuring proper scrutiny. But importantly, I think, giving an ambassadorial role, which going forward with the new structure could be very important. That the work of the Trust should be allied to a 5-year plan seems to me a good, if fairly obvious idea, as does the idea of an audit of assets. It also seems to be sensible to call the Trust in law what it is called in life and in its everyday working. So Section 4 of the bill seems to me to be sensible, and I was struck by the point, Presiding Officer, made by one of the witnesses to the Bill Committee that the confusion over name can sometimes result in bequeaths from individuals who have passed away going to the wrong organisation, not something that any of us want to see. Presiding Officer, that the review by Sir George Reid was welcomed so overwhelmingly by the members of the National Trust should give us great faith in these provisions as we go forward. Scottish Labour supports the bill today, looks forward to further discussion in Parliament and wishes the National Trust for Scotland and its staff all the very best as they take these measures forward for the future.
Thank you very much. And I now call Alex Ferguson with a slightly generous 3 minutes.
Does that mean I can go back to 4 minutes? Or is it? No, it doesn't. So, okay, thank you. Presiding Officer, I'm pleased to be taking part in this short debate, even if it is just as an inadequate deputy for my colleague Jamie McGrigor, who is unavoidably committed elsewhere this afternoon. The National Trust, I believe, showed great sense in asking our former presiding officer to carry out the review that is behind the legislation in front of us this afternoon. As the convener has already said, in typical style, Sir George pulled no punches in undertaking that review, and what is emerging as a result is a National Trust that is surely far more fit for purpose and ready to face up to the very real challenges which it will be faced with over the coming years. Given the constraints of time, I want to focus on one aspect of the bill, presiding officer, which is the provision within the bill that addresses co-opted membership of the Board of Trustees. The 1935 order that established the Trust on a statutory footing provides for the Board of Trustees to co-opt additional members for up to 1 year at a time in order to gain extra expertise. The Reid Review endorsed those arrangements of the 1935 order, which it felt were important to continue, and I quote, to ensure an appropriate range of experience and skills among trustees. Now, that must surely be especially true in light of the drastic reduction in the number of trustees, quite rightly, that has taken place. But the bill aims also to add to that arrangement by introducing a longer period of co-option to the Board of Trustees, up to 4 years rather than just the one that is currently the situation, and the Trust feels that this measure will increase the likelihood of securing suitable candidates. I find that very hard to disagree with. I know the committee was quite surprised to learn during evidence that the chairman himself, Sir Kenneth Cowman, is a co-opted member of the Board of Trustees, and he described the need for co-opted members of the board as a means of ensuring that, and again I quote, we have people who fit the bits that are missing on the board. He argued that it would be easier to find a replacement chairman when he steps down if there is greater certainty over the length of the appointment, and again it is hard to disagree. Now, I understand that there is nothing currently to prevent co-opted members from having their roles renewed each year, but that they can only be appointed for 1 year at a time. Sir George quite rightly asked the question, why would someone with significant skills, experience and reputation take a job on if it's only for 1 year? We didn't often argue with him when he was our presiding officer, and I think it would be unwise to do so now. Sir Kenneth Cowman added to that due to the size, complexity and geographical extent of the organisation, people needed a year just to get up to speed with the work of the board. And I think it's also important to note in this debate that Oscar also welcomed the provision that I'm speaking about. So, in closing, presiding officer, I understand the committee is persuaded by the arguments that there should be a mechanism allowing co-opted members of the Board of Trustees to be appointed for terms of up to 4 years, and I note that the board could continue to appoint co-opted members for a fewer number than 4 if it considers that to be appropriate. All of this, presiding officer, seems eminently sensible, and we support not just this provision of the bill, but we will support the bill itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We now turn to the winding up speeches, and I call on Fiona Hislop, Cabinet Secretary. 4 minutes, please.
Okay. Presiding officer, the Scottish Government is fully supportive of these proposals. It looks forward to continuing its excellent relationship with the Trust as we move towards an exciting time in the future. The work of the Trust links with considerable cross-section of the Government's work, from culture to rural affairs to education, and the coming years will be a period where many opportunities present themselves, and we recognise that the National Trust will be a key partner enabling Scotland to take full advantage of the opportunities. And as I remarked earlier, discussion of this bill has served to highlight the importance of the National Trust to Scotland, to its culture and heritage, to its environment, to its local communities and to its economy. It has provided us with an opportunity to appreciate the problems that the Trust has faced in recent years and the way in which it has positively responded. Its actions have been efficient and effective and should be welcomed by all in the Chamber today. Challenges there were and challenges will remain. The needs of our heritage are many and resources will always be scarcer than we'd wish. Scotland needs a National Trust which is vibrant, efficient and effective, independent yet a key player in Team Scotland, working as a partner of government and of communities at national and local level, helping to conserve and to unlock the social and economic benefits that can and should be derived from Scotland's incomparable historic and natural heritage. The changes this bill will implement are necessary in enabling this ambition to be achieved. George Reid appreciated this in his review. Trust members appreciated this by overwhelmingly approving these measures, and perhaps most relevantly today, the Cabinet Subcommittee on Legislation has appreciated this too. And the Bill Committee's meticulous report, for which they deserve our wholehearted thanks, confirms that this is appropriate, that our Parliament takes forward the legislative means to complete the reforms recommended by the Reid Review. By doing so, we will enable the Trust to continue on its course as a leading conservation charity with a modern governance structure fit for the challenges of the 21st century. I agree, and the Government agrees, that this bill should proceed, and I also think that the Trust deserves no less than our full support in its most valuable work for Scotland and indeed for the peoples of Scotland.
Thank you very much. And I now call on Jane Baxter to wind up, and you have until just before 5 o'clock.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I just begin by thanking my fellow committee members and the clerks. This is my first experience of being a deputy convener of anything, and it's been part of a private member's bill. So I had a lot to learn, and I certainly have learned a lot, but very much enjoyed the experience. It was a pleasure to work with you, so thanks to everyone who was so kind and supportive to me. I'd also like to thank people who gave both verbal and written evidence: Sir George Reid, Professor Sir Kenneth Calman, the Prospect Trade Union and Oscar, the Office of the Scottish Charity Regulator, and we were pleased to receive their evidence. As the convener Fiona MacLeod pointed out, National Trust for Scotland was at a crisis point and subject to criticism from Oscar, and Sir George Reid was asked to conduct a review and did so with a full programme of engagement, participation and consultation. And the reforms were endorsed in 2010 overwhelmingly. The Cabinet Secretary, Fiona Hislop, pointed out the number of assets that the Trust has: buildings, land, landscapes. They indulge in projects, they support volunteers, they raise funds and rely very heavily on the body of their membership to direct their work. And those are all assets that are very important for Scotland. And so it's been a pleasure to be part of the legislative action which was needed to complete that journey for the National Trust for Scotland, which provides a voice for heritage issues in a Team Scotland approach. And I really like that phrase that the Cabinet Secretary used, a Team Scotland approach.
I'm sorry, can I stop you just for a moment? Could we have some order and courtesy in the chamber for the member, please? Jane Baxter.
One of the themes that came out of the work that we did as a committee was the importance of, as the Trust continues into the future, that it will develop and maintain partnerships and increasingly rely on that approach rather than a structure which is dictated by representativeness and positions. It's very important that they've agreed that they're going to engage with people and get the best out of people and go on to exploit the educational and economic benefits that can come from working in those ways. James Dornan demonstrated his knowledge of the history of the Trust in his constituency, but then went on to speak about its ongoing relevance today. Patricia Ferguson said that the Trust was entrusted with Scotland's heritage and was a significant organisation that merits the approach being taken. This is a very significant national organisation. And then I was pleased to hear Alec Ferguson say that this organisation is now fit for purpose to face the future challenges that are ahead for it. Perhaps conclude by saying that when I was first encouraged to take part in this committee, I realised my complete ignorance of the National Trust for Scotland, and I thought that I hadn't actually been to any National Trust properties or premises. So I had a look online and discovered, to my shame, that I've actually been to quite a few, but didn't know that. I wasn't aware that places that I've enjoyed going to and enjoyed visiting were even connected to the National Trust for Scotland. If you'd asked me, I'd have said I don't know anything about this. So I've discovered that not only I got a lot to learn, but maybe that's a real learning point for the Trust about how they promote and market their identity as the custodian of these buildings and these assets. I've made a personal note to self for the summer that I'm going to get round more of the National Trust premises. There are some in Fife, and so I'm going to make a point of visiting them and increasing my knowledge of the wonderful work that the Trust does in Fife and in the rest of Scotland. That's not quite 1659, but I'd like to conclude there, if that's okay. Thanks.
Thank you very much, and that indeed concludes the debate on motion number S4M 06243 in the name of Fiona MacLeod on behalf of the National Trust for Scotland Governance, etc. Bill Committee on the preliminary stage of the National Trust for Scotland Governance, etc. Bill. Now, before we move on to the next item of business, could I have some order in chamber, please? I would just like to remind members, because during the previous debate to that one, they had slipped back into some bad habits this afternoon. So could I remind members, please, that they should not call each other by first names or nicknames, speak directly to each other across the chamber, particularly on the front benches, and they should not conduct conversations standing with their back to the presiding officer. We were reminding members of this previously, and I would be extremely grateful if members could take that on board with regard to their conduct in the chamber. We're now going to come to the next item of business, which is decision time. And there are two questions which are going to be put as a result of today's business. If I could have some order, please. The first question is that motion 6244 in the name of Michael McMahon on behalf of the Welfare Reform Committee on the impact of welfare reform on Scotland be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Parliament is agreed. And the second question is that motion 6243 in the name of Fiona MacLeod on behalf of the National Trust for Scotland Governance, etc. Bill Committee on the preliminary stage of the National Trust for Scotland Governance, etc. Bill be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Thank you. We are agreed, and that concludes decision time. I will allow a short pause to allow members who are not participating in the debate to leave the chamber and to do so quietly, please.